She hit the ground face first and nobody stopped. The stagecoach was gone. The men who robbed it were gone. Her money, her trunk, her letters of introduction, all of it gone. What was left was a 26-year-old woman named Evelyn Harper, sprawled in the dust of the New Mexico desert in the brutal summer of 1886, with nothing but the dress on her back and a heartbeat that was getting quieter by the hour. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She just stopped moving, and that was the moment a stranger's hoofbeats changed everything. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and follow Evelyn's journey all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. 3 days. That was how long Evelyn Harper had been alone. Not alone the way a person is alone on a quiet Sunday morning in a comfortable house with a cup of tea and a good book. Alone in the way that strips every pretense from a human being. Alone in the way that makes you realize exactly how much of what you thought was strength was really just comfort dressed up in borrowed clothes. 3 days since the stagecoach had been ambushed 12 miles east of Raton Pass. 3 days since she had watched a man get pistol-whipped across the face for hesitating too long, handing over his wallet. 3 days since she had pressed herself against the floor of that coach with her hands over her mouth, telling herself, "Don't make a sound. Don't give them a reason. Just breathe." And 3 days since she had crawled out of that overturned coach into the New Mexico heat, with the robbers already vanishing into the ridgeline like smoke, and realized that every single thing she had carried west with her, every dollar, every letter, every carefully folded piece of her plan, was gone. She had walked north by northwest because that was the direction the driver had told her the next town was before he'd been dragged off the road at gunpoint. She had walked the first day with purpose. She had walked the second day with desperation. By the third day, she was not really walking anymore. She was moving her feet. There is a difference. A person walks when they believe they are going somewhere. Evelyn was simply refusing to fall down, until she did. Dun. The sound her knees made when they hit the dirt was not dramatic. It was not the sound of a story. It was quiet and small and absolutely final. The way a door closing softly in an empty house can be more devastating than a door slamming. She did not cry out. She had no water left for tears. She simply went down, and then sideways, and then she was lying on her back, looking up at a sky so indifferently blue it almost made her angry. Not here, she thought. Please. Not like this. She had come so far. She had sold her piano, the one her mother left her to buy the stagecoach ticket. She had stood in the middle of the parlor after the buyer took it away, and told herself this was not loss, this was investment. She had believed it. She had packed her trunk with her school books and her spare dress, and her father's pocket watch, and a photograph of her mother. And she had gotten on a train at South Station in Boston on a Tuesday morning in June, while her neighbor Mrs. Aldrich cried on the platform and said, "Evelyn Harper, you are either the bravest woman I know or the most foolish." And Evelyn had laughed and said, "I'll let you know when I get there." She hadn't gotten there. She was lying in the dust of the New Mexico desert. Her lips cracked so badly they had split and dried shut again. Her hands blistered from catching herself when she'd stumbled over a rock 8 hours ago, and the last thing she had eaten was half a cracker she'd found in the bottom of a saddlebag that the robbers had thrown off the coach and not bothered to take. She stared up at that blue sky. "I am not a helpless woman," she told herself. "I am not." But the sky did not argue with her, and neither did her body, and after a moment that felt longer than the 3 days before it, Evelyn Harper closed her eyes. She did not hear the horse. She was too far gone for that. What she felt later, much later, when she could feel things again, was a shadow. The particular quality of shade that falls when something large passes between a person and the sun. She had been burning for 3 days. That shadow was the first cool thing she had known since the robbery, and even in the deep well of unconsciousness, she had fallen into some part of her turned toward it, the way a plant turns toward water. Then there was a voice. Low, male, not unkind. Hey, Hey, can you hear me? She could not answer. Ma'am? A hand on her shoulder, careful not rough. The kind of touch that asks permission even when there is no time to wait for it. Don't move. I've got you. And then the ground left her, and Evelyn Harper was lifted off the desert floor by a man she had never met, and for the first time in 3 days, she was not alone. Caleb Whitmore was not a man who talked much. People in the territory knew this. His ranch hands knew this. The owner of the dry goods store in Cimarron knew this. Knew that when Caleb Whitmore came in twice a month for supplies, you measured out what he needed, told him the price, and let the silence be. He wasn't rude about it. He wasn't cold exactly. He was just a man who had decided somewhere along the line that words cost something, and he was careful about what he spent. He was 34 years old. He had owned the Whitmore Ranch for 6 years, which meant he had bought it 2 years after his wife Clara died of fever in the spring of 1878. People had told him not to buy the ranch. Caleb, it's too much for one man. You need to go back east, be around family. What do you need all that land for if there's no one to share it with? He hadn't answered any of them. He'd bought the ranch and he'd worked it, and he'd hired 3 good men, and he'd gotten up every morning before sunrise for 6 years and done what needed doing. The ranch was successful by any measure that mattered in the territory. His cattle were healthy, his fences held, his workers were paid fair and on time. But when they rode back to their own homes at the end of the day, the Whitmore Ranch was the quietest place in all of New Mexico. Caleb had made his peace with that. Or so he told himself every night when the silence got heavy enough to press down on his chest like a stone. He had been riding back from the southern pasture when he saw her. At first, he thought it was a bundle of cloth. People dropped things crossing the desert trunks. Blankets, all manner of goods when the weight got to be too much. He had found stranger things. But something about the shape of it made him pull up the reins, and when he did, and when his horse Amos shifted the angle of the afternoon light, changed just enough for him to see a hand. A woman's hand. Palm up in the dirt. Still, he was off the horse before he had decided to move. That was the thing about Caleb Whitmore. He could think about something forever. But when the moment came that actually required action, his body had always been faster than his doubts. He crouched beside her, and his stomach dropped. She was young. Mid-20s, he'd guess. Dark hair unpinned now and spread out in the dust. Dress that had once been a respectable gray-blue, now more brown than anything. Lips split and dry. Hands that had been blistered and left to blister again. Hey! Hey, can you hear me? Nothing. Ma'am? He pressed 2 fingers to the side of her neck. Her pulse was there, thin, faster than it should be, but there. Don't move. I've got you. He lifted her as carefully as he could manage, which for a man who spent his days throwing hay bales and stretching fence wire was considerably careful, and he settled her across the front of his saddle with her back against his chest and her head falling against his shoulder, and he turned Amos north toward the ranch. He did not know this woman. He did not know what had happened to her or where she'd come from, or what she'd been doing out here alone. He only knew that she was breathing barely, and that she had not chosen to be here any more than any creature chose to be abandoned in a desert. And that was enough for Caleb Whitmore. That had always been enough for him. Warren. She woke up fighting. That was the first thing that surprised him. He had brought her inside the ranch house and laid her down on the narrow cot he kept in the back room, a room that had no particular purpose anymore, which was a polite way of saying it had once been meant to be a nursery and then stopped being anything at all. He had sent his ranch hand, a young man named Pete Dawson, to ride for the nearest woman who knew medicine, which meant Mrs. Cordelia Vance, the wife of a cattle broker in Cimarron, who was 72 years old and had delivered approximately 40% of the children in that part of the territory, and had no patience for anyone who wasted her time. But Mrs. Vance was an hour's ride away, and in the meantime he had done what he could, water a little pressed to her lips with a clean cloth, a damp towel across her forehead. He'd taken off her boots and seen that her feet were in worse condition than her hands. He had just stood up from setting a glass of water on the small table beside her when she woke up. Her eyes flew open. Her hand shot out and grabbed his wrist. Her grip was remarkable for a woman who had been unconscious 5 minutes ago. "Don't," she said. Her voice was barely there, a scraped, dry thing like something dragged across gravel, but the word was absolutely clear. "Don't touch me." "All right," Caleb said. He held very still. His wrist was still in her grip. "All right, I won't touch you." She looked at him with eyes that were still half out of focus, the gaze of someone trying to work out whether they're awake or dreaming. "Where?" She stopped, swallowed. "Where am I?" "My ranch, north of where I found you, about 7 miles north, give or take." "You found me." "You were unconscious on the trail." A pause. Her eyes moved around the room, up across, measuring, counting. He recognized that. That was not fear. That was a person with a good mind, waking up in a strange place and running inventory. "How long?" she asked. "How long have you been here? Less than an hour. You only just came around." "No." She shook her head slowly, like it hurt, which it probably did. "How long was I out there?" "In the desert, I don't know. From the look of things, at least a day. Maybe 2. She let go of his wrist. She closed her eyes. For a moment he thought she was going to go back under, and he reached for the glass of water, and she said without opening her eyes, 3 days. Caleb went very still. 3 days, she said again. "I've been out there 3 days. He set the glass down carefully. "Can you tell me your name?" A long breath. Then Evelyn Harper. "Caleb Whitmore." Silence. Then she opened her eyes and looked at him, and for the first time there was something in them beyond fear and calculation. Something that might have been the beginning of an assessment. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "I am going to need water, and then I am going to need you to tell me exactly where I am and how far it is to the nearest town. And then I would be very grateful if you would leave me alone for a few minutes to collect myself." Caleb looked at her for a moment. He had found a woman who had been dying in the desert 40 minutes ago. She was now making requests. He handed her the glass of water. "There's a town called Cimarron, about 8 miles east," he said. "I've sent for a woman who can look at your feet and hands. She'll be here within the hour." "My feet," she said flatly, as if the indignity of him having seen the state of her feet was somehow worse than the rest of it. They needed to come out of those boots. Yes. She pressed her lips together. Then, "Thank you for finding me." "Don't thank me for that," Caleb said. "Anyone would have done it." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. It was not disagreement exactly. It was more like the look of someone who has seen enough of the world to know that what he'd just said was not actually true, and who chose in this moment not to say so. "I'll leave you be," he said. And he did. Mrs. Cordelia Vance arrived 45 minutes later, dismounted without assistance, despite her 72 years, walked into the back room and shut the door in Caleb's face with the cheerful efficiency of a woman who had been doing exactly what she needed to do for 50 years. Caleb stood in his kitchen and listened to the muffled sound of voices through the door. Mrs. Vance's voice low, matter-of-fact, asking questions. Evelyn Harper's voice answering. Calmer than he'd expected. Direct. Then Mrs. Vance's voice rose slightly, not in alarm, but in that particular register of indignation older women reserved for hearing about human cruelty from a safe distance. The register that meant she'd just been told something that offended her sense of order. The robbery. She was telling her about the robbery. Caleb sat down at his kitchen table. He looked at his hands. He had lived on this land for 6 years. In 6 years, the only voice he'd heard in this kitchen, besides his own, was Pete Dawson's, and Pete mostly talked about horses. Before that, before the last 6 years, there had been Clara's voice in this kitchen. Clara, who hummed while she cooked. Clara, who had an opinion about everything, and shared it freely, and laughed when he disagreed with her, and said, "Caleb Whitmore, you are wrong about this, and I love you anyway." He had not thought about that in a long time. He had gotten very good at not thinking about it. He stood up and put a pot of water on to heat, because Mrs. Vance would want tea when she came out, and it gave him something to do with his hands. Mrs. Vance emerged 20 minutes later, sat down at his table, accepted the cup of tea he poured for her without comment, and said, "That woman has a spine made of iron and a body that's been pushed past what most men could take. Will she recover? The hands will heal. The feet will be tender for a week, maybe two. She's dehydrated, but she's been drinking and keeping it down, which is a good sign." Mrs. Vance set down her cup. "She told me what happened, about the robbery." "Yes. She's got nothing left. Not a cent, not a trunk, not a letter. She said she was on her way to take a teaching position in a place called Morrow Creek." Caleb knew Morrow Creek, a small rough settlement about 60 miles west. It had been trying to establish itself for 3 years. Last he'd heard, they'd been desperate enough for a schoolteacher that they'd sent advertisements all the way to eastern newspapers. "She can't walk 60 miles on those feet," he said. "No." Mrs. Vance gave him a look that was not unkind, but was absolutely direct. "She can't go anywhere for at least a week, maybe 2. Caleb said nothing. "I told her she could rest here," Mrs. Vance said calmly. "I hope that was all right." It was not a real question. "Of course," Caleb said. "Good." She stood up, taking her cup with her and rinsing it herself at the basin, because Mrs. Vance was that kind of woman. "She'll fight you on it, you know, letting you take care of her. She's not the type to accept charity, and she'll likely dress it up as stubbornness, but what it really is—" She paused, handing him the cup dry. "Is a woman who has been let down by too many people to trust that help doesn't come with a cost." Caleb held the cup. "I'll keep that in mind," he said. Mrs. Vance put on her hat, picked up her bag, and walked to the door. "She's a remarkable woman, Caleb," she said, "not like gossip, like a fact being recorded. Whatever happened to her out there didn't break her. It just rearranged her." She left. Caleb stood in his kitchen with a clean cup in his hand and a woman in his back room and the quietest house in New Mexico, suddenly feeling very slightly less quiet. She came out of the back room that evening. He heard her moving slow, careful footsteps, the sound of someone being extremely deliberate about where they put their weight, and he looked up from the harness he'd been mending at the table, and there she was in the doorway, leaning one hand against the frame, wearing a clean shirt he'd left folded outside the door because her dress was in a condition that he'd thought she'd want to change out of. The shirt was his. It was enormous on her. She had used something, a piece of leather lace from somewhere, to cinch it at the waist, and her hair was pinned back as neatly as a woman with no mirror and no pins could manage. She was standing straight despite her feet. She looked at him. He looked at her. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "All right. I'm not staying here as a guest." Caleb set down the harness. "How do you mean?" "I mean, I am aware that your foreman's wife told you I could rest here, and I appreciate that, and I understand I cannot walk to Cimarron tonight. But I am not going to sit in that room and be dependent on your charity. I want to work." He looked at her feet. Even in the oversized boots she'd put back on, the only ones she had, he could see the careful way she was distributing her weight. "You can barely stand," he said. "I can stand fine. Walking is the problem. Standing I can manage. What kind of work are you proposing?" She looked around the kitchen with the same systematic gaze she'd used when she woke up, taking inventory, cataloging, assessing. "I'm a teacher. I know how to organize, how to keep records, how to read and write well enough to manage correspondence. I can cook not well, but adequately. I can see by your table that you have a system for your work that could use a second pair of eyes." He followed her gaze to the table. The papers there. Supply orders, cattle records, the land survey he'd been putting off dealing with for 3 months. "You looked at my papers," he said. "I walked past your table. I couldn't help seeing them. And you formed an opinion. I have opinions about most things. It's a quality that has not always served me well." She met his eyes directly. "But in this case, Mr. Whitmore, I think you could use some help with your correspondence, and I could use something to do that doesn't involve lying in a room thinking about everything I've lost. So I'm asking you to let me work for my keep. Not as charity, as an arrangement. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He looked at this woman who had been unconscious in the desert 4 hours ago and was now standing in his kitchen in his oversized shirt, negotiating the terms of her employment. "You can organize the papers on the table," he said, "and after that you can sit back down." Something moved in her face too quick for him to name it. Relief, maybe, or something older than relief. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said again, the same words he'd used before. This time she did disagree. "Mr. Whitmore," she said quietly, "I am going to thank you whether you like it or not. You are going to have to find a way to live with that." She crossed the room to the table, sat down carefully across from his papers, and began to work. Caleb picked up his harness. The kitchen was no longer quiet, and for the first time in a very long time, he did not know what to do with that. Her first week at the Whitmore Ranch was not peaceful. It was not the kind of recovery story where a woman lies still and lets herself be cared for and wakes up gradually better. That was not Evelyn Harper's style of recovery. Her style was to push exactly as hard as her body allowed, and approximately 15% harder than that, and to negotiate fiercely when anyone suggested otherwise. Caleb's ranch hand, Pete Dawson, who was 22 years old, freckled, and had the permanently startled expression of a young man who had not yet made peace with the unpredictability of life, met her on the second morning when she was up before sunrise and standing at the kitchen stove trying to figure out the flu. "Ma'am," he said from the doorway, hat in hand, blinking at her. What are you?" "Good morning," she said pleasantly. "The flu sticks. Is there a trick to it?" Pete stared at her. She stared back. "Third lever," he said finally. "You gotta pull it and push at the same time." "Thank you." She did it. The flu opened. Pete stood there. "You should be resting, ma'am," he said. "Boss's orders. Your boss said I could help around the ranch in exchange for room and board. I'm helping." She looked at the shelf above the stove where 4 different kinds of beans had been stored in jars with no labels, in what she was beginning to understand was Caleb Whitmore's organizational philosophy, which was to say, no organizational philosophy at all. "Do you know which of these is pinto and which is kidney?" "The wide one on the left," Pete said, pointing. "Then, boss didn't exactly say you could help in the kitchen. He said I could do whatever my feet allowed." "Your feet allowed you to be up at 5 in the morning." "My feet are not in charge of my morning," Evelyn said evenly. "I am." Pete thought about this. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He stayed for breakfast, which she made with the pinto beans and some cornmeal she found in a tin, and which Pete ate with the expression of a man who had been surviving on his own cooking for 6 years and had just been reminded what food was supposed to taste like. "You're a real good cook, ma'am," he said. "No offense, but it beats what we usually have." "What do you usually have?" "Whatever me and Hector can make without burning the tin." "Who's Hector?" "Other ranch hand. He's out on the north fence right now. And there's old Thomas. He's the one who knows horses best. He doesn't come in for meals, he eats in the barn." Pete paused. "By choice. He just likes the barn." "How long have the 3 of you worked here?" "Me and Hector about 4 years. Thomas was here before the boss bought the place." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "And Mr. Whitmore, does he eat with you?" Pete looked at his plate. "Not mostly. He eats at the table when he's doing his papers, or he doesn't eat till late." "Does he talk to you at meals?" Pete considered this carefully with the gravity of a young man who takes honesty seriously. "He talks about the work. What needs doing. He's fair, ma'am, real fair. Better boss than most." A pause. "He's just not a talking kind of man." "No," Evelyn said. "I noticed." She noticed other things too. She noticed that the ranch house was clean, genuinely clean. The kind of clean that came from a person who had been doing it alone for a long time and had made a practice of it not for comfort, but because letting things go to disorder would have felt like giving something up. She noticed that the only decoration in the main room was a small framed photograph on the mantel. A woman young with a composed expression and dark eyes, and that the photograph had been dusted recently. She noticed that Caleb Whitmore rose before dawn, worked until after dark, and treated every hour in between like a problem to be solved. She noticed that he checked on her, not in an obvious way, not in the way of a man who wanted to be noticed checking on someone. He would come into the kitchen on his way in from the barn and say something about the weather or the fence line, and while he was saying it, his eyes would make a quick assessment of her hands, face color, and then he would go back to whatever he was doing, and he would not do it again for 2 or 3 hours. She was a teacher. She knew what it looked like when someone was paying careful attention and pretending not to. She did not say anything about it, but she noticed. Mauds. On the 4th day, they had their first real argument. It was about the land survey papers. She had organized his desk with his permission. A permission he had given somewhat reluctantly on the second morning, standing in the doorway of the main room, watching her look at his papers with the expression of a woman who could see a system that needed to exist and couldn't rest until it did. "I won't move anything without telling you first," she had said. "I just want to help you find things more easily." "Things are easy to find," he said. "They're on the table." "They are on the table," she agreed. "All of them, in a pile." He had looked at her. She had looked back. "Fine," he said. She had organized. She had separated the supply orders from the cattle records, and the cattle records from the correspondence, and the correspondence from the survey papers. And in doing so, she had read enough of the survey papers to understand what they said, which was that there was a boundary dispute with a neighboring landowner, a man named Fletcher, that had been going on apparently for at least a year, based on the dates of the letters. On the 4th day, she put the stack in front of him. "This needs to be answered," she said. He looked at the stack. "I know. The last letter from Fletcher's attorney is dated 4 months ago. I know. Mr. Whitmore, if you don't respond..." "I know what happens if I don't respond, Miss Harper." She stopped. He never used her name. He'd been calling her ma'am or nothing. "Then why haven't you..." The silence lasted long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "Because responding means starting a thing that won't end quietly," he said. "And I've got enough that doesn't end quietly." Something in his voice made her be still. She looked at him across the table. "Fletcher's pushing for 20 acres of the north pasture," he said. It was not really an explanation. It was the sound of a man who had been carrying something alone for long enough that it had started to change his posture. "He says the original survey line was drawn wrong. My survey says different. His attorney says mine is wrong. My attorney, which I haven't got anymore since Hutchins retired, would say different." "You don't have an attorney. I don't have the money for one right now. Cattle market's been poor 2 seasons running." She pulled the stack toward her and looked at the dates again. "I can write the response," she said. "You're a school teacher. I am a school teacher who reads very carefully and writes very clearly and has spent most of the last year corresponding with school board officials who are by professional necessity masters of saying nothing in complicated language." She met his eyes. "I know how to respond to this kind of letter. I won't pretend to be a lawyer, but I can keep the door open long enough for you to find one." He looked at the stack. He looked at her. He looked at the stack again. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. She began to write. He watched her for a moment. She could feel it without looking up, and then he went back to his work. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the summer light was going gold and horizontal. Pete was somewhere out back making the sound of someone trying to fix something with a hammer and not quite succeeding. It was the most domestic moment Caleb Whitmore had experienced in 6 years. He didn't know what to do with it, so he did what he always did. He put his head down and worked. On the 5th day, something shifted. It was small. If either of them had been paying attention in the conscious way, they might have noticed it and immediately done something to prevent it. But the small shifts are always the ones you don't see coming because they don't announce themselves. They just happen like weather. What happened was, she laughed. She had been talking to Pete in the yard. He was showing her how to check a fence post for rot, which she had asked about, because she was fundamentally a person who wanted to understand how everything worked. And Pete said something that surprised a laugh out of her, sudden and real, the kind of laugh that a person makes when they've forgotten they're capable of laughing. Caleb was on the far side of the barn. He heard it. He stopped what he was doing. He did not know what he was feeling. But he stood there for a moment, with his hands still listening to the sound of laughter in a yard that had not had any in a very long time. Then he went back to work. But something had shifted. He didn't know its name yet. He wasn't ready to know its name yet. But it was there. Kimya. On the sixth day, she found the books. There was a crate of them in the back room, the room that wasn't a nursery anymore, shoved against the wall and covered with a canvas cloth. She had been in there on an errand she'd assigned herself, which was to take stock of what supplies the ranch had in reserve, so she could suggest a more efficient storage system, and she'd bumped the canvas and pulled it back, and there they were. Novels, mostly. History. One very worn book of poetry that had been read so many times, the spine was soft as cloth. A primer. A reader. 2 volumes of geography. She sat down on the floor right there with her feet still tender and the afternoon light coming through the small window, and she opened the primer and held it in her hands, the way a person holds something they've been missing without knowing what it was they were missing. She heard boots in the doorway. Those were Clara's, Caleb said. He was standing in the doorway. He had not meant to say it. She could tell because his voice had the quality of words that surprise even the person saying them. She looked up. "Your wife?" A pause. "Yes." She looked down at the primer, back up at him. She was a teacher too. She wanted to be. She didn't get the chance. She held the book carefully. "May I read them while I'm here?" He looked at the crate for a moment. At her. At the crate. "Yes," he said. He left. She sat on the floor a little longer, holding the primer. She thought about Clara Whitmore, who had wanted to be a teacher and didn't get the chance. She thought about her own classroom that she hadn't gotten to, yet 60 miles west, full of children she hadn't met. She thought about what Mrs. Vance had said, though she hadn't been meant to hear it. "She's remarkable, Caleb. Whatever happened to her out there didn't break her." She thought about whether that was true. She thought about the way Caleb Whitmore had stood in that doorway, saying those were Clara's, as if the words cost him something specific and measurable. She set the primer down, picked up the book of poetry, opened it. The margins were full of pencil notes, small, careful handwriting. Clara's handwriting. She turned the pages slowly. Every note was a thought about a poem. A disagreement, an agreement, a question. "Is this what he means?" one note said beside a verse about loss. "Or is it that we can only understand what we've already lost?" Evelyn Harper sat on the floor of the room that wasn't a nursery anymore and read a dead woman's thoughts in the margins of a book of poetry, and for the first time since the robbery, she cried. Not for herself, for the woman who had wanted to be a teacher, for the man in the kitchen who had built 6 years of silence around her absence. For all of it, the unfairness of it, the weight of it, the particular human tragedy of people who love each other and still run out of time. She cried quietly. She had always been quiet about hard things. Then she wiped her face, put the book carefully back in the crate, covered it with the canvas, and went to make dinner. "Mine." On the 7th day, Caleb Whitmore said, "Your feet look better." They were at the kitchen table. She had made eggs and biscuits. He had eaten without comment, which she had learned to interpret as approval. She looked up. "They are better. Another week and I could probably make the walk to Cimarron." He cut a biscuit. "You don't need to walk. I can take you in the wagon." "You've done enough. Miss Harper." He looked at her directly, the way he did when he wanted something to be understood and didn't want to use 10 words when 3 would do. "I can take you in the wagon." She looked at him. He was not a soft man. He was not a man who made things easy to receive. But he was, she understood now, 1 week, in a man who meant every word he said, which meant that when he said little everything he said mattered. "All right," she said. "Thank you." "Don't," he started. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, and she heard the echo of her own voice from 7 days ago. "I am going to thank you. You are going to have to live with it." The silence went on 1 beat longer than usual. And then, so quiet, she almost missed it. Caleb Whitmore smiled. Not big, just a small private thing, the kind of smile that comes from somewhere deep enough that the person wearing it doesn't always know it's there. He looked back at his plate. She looked back at hers. But the kitchen, which had been becoming less quiet every day, became a little less quiet still. And out on the desert road, 7 miles south, the dust had settled back over the place where she had fallen. But Evelyn Harper was not on that road anymore. She was here. And she was not, she realized, with something she could not quite name. She was not counting the days until she left. What neither of them knew yet, what neither of them could have known in that quiet kitchen with the morning light coming through the window and the biscuits going cold between them, was that a man named Silas Crow had not forgotten Evelyn Harper. He had left one witness alive on the desert road, and now he knew exactly where she was. The morning Caleb drove Evelyn to Cimarron, she sat beside him on the wagon bench, and neither of them spoke for the first 4 miles. That was not uncomfortable. That was the first thing she noticed, that silence with Caleb Whitmore had stopped being uncomfortable sometime in the second week, without her realizing it. It had changed texture. From the silence of two strangers measuring each other to something quieter and more settled, the way a room feels different once you've learned where everything is kept. She was watching the road. He was watching the horses. Pete had waved them off from the yard with an expression of studied casualness that fooled neither of them. At the 4-mile mark, Caleb said, "You don't have to go back today if you're not ready." She turned to look at him. "I need to send a letter to the school board in Morrow Creek," she said. "Let them know what happened and whether the position is still available." "I know. I meant after that. You don't have to rush." She looked at him for a moment longer than she meant to. He was watching the road. "Mr. Whitmore," she said carefully, "are you asking me to stay?" A pause, long enough that a less patient woman might have filled it. "I'm saying there's no reason to hurry," he said. "That's all." She looked back at the road. "All right," she said. They rode the last 4 miles without talking, and what was between them in that silence was something that neither of them was ready to call by its real name, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so. That was, Evelyn thought, probably the most honest conversation she had ever had. Cimarron was small in the way that frontier towns are small, not quaint, not charming, but aggressively practical. Every building and every person visibly organized around the central project of surviving in a place that was not naturally hospitable to human settlement. The post office doubled as a general store. The general store had a back room that served on Saturday nights as a saloon. The church had been built before the school, which told you everything you needed to know about the town's priorities. Caleb pulled up outside the post office and tied the horses and helped her down from the wagon without making a thing of it, simply offering his hand, because her feet were still not entirely reliable on uneven ground, and she took it without making a thing of that either. The postmaster was a man named Garfield, who had a magnificent mustache and the territorial news memorized down to the last detail. He looked at Evelyn the way he looked at everything like information to be catalogued. "You're the woman Caleb brought in," he said, "from the road." "I am," Evelyn said. She had learned in the 2 weeks since the robbery that the direct approach to her own story was easier than bracing against the way other people told it for her. "I need to send a letter to Morrow Creek. Is there a reliable way to get correspondence there?" "Ryder goes west on Thursdays," Garfield said. "Today's Tuesday. If you want it on Thursday's run, write it today." "I'll write it now." Garfield produced paper and ink with the efficiency of a man who spent his days making this exact transaction possible. She sat down at the small table he kept for that purpose and wrote the letter to the Morrow Creek School Board quickly and without sentimentality, because the letter needed to do a job and sentiment would not help it do the job. She explained what had happened. She explained her current situation. She asked plainly whether the position was still being held, and if so, for how long, and she gave Caleb's ranch as her return address. She sealed it, paid for the postage with the 2 coins Caleb had quietly pressed into her hand. Before she went in, she had started to protest, and he had said flatly, "Don't," in a tone that closed the matter, and stood up. Garfield was watching her with the unashamed directness of a man in a small town who understood that other people's business was the primary entertainment available. "You a teacher?" he said. "I am." He leaned on the counter. "We've been needing one here. Not just in Morrow Creek. Right here in Cimarron. We got 17 children of school age and nowhere to put them." Evelyn looked at him. "Who's the head of the town council?" "That'd be Mr. Aldrich, hardware store end of the main street." She looked at the sealed letter in her hand. "Thank you," she said, and then she walked out. She found Caleb at the wagon, talking to another man, stocky, sun-worn, with the kind of careful stillness that meant he was paying more attention than he appeared to be. When Evelyn approached, Caleb made the introduction without preamble. "Miss Harper, this is Holt Deaver. He runs the cattle operation north of my property line." "Ma'am?" Deaver touched his hat. His eyes took her in with a quick, practiced assessment that was not unfriendly, but was thorough. "Heard about what happened to you. Rough business." "It was," she said simply. "Robbery gang that hit your stage, they're still out there," Deaver said. He said it directly the way men in frontier territories delivered bad news without wrapping it in softness. "Sheriff out of Taos has been running them for 3 weeks. They hit a freight wagon 2 days after your stage." Something cold moved through her. Not fear, not exactly. More like the particular sensation of learning that the thing you'd been trying to put behind you was still in motion. "Do they know who they are?" she asked. Deaver and Caleb exchanged a look, the kind of look that has its own language. "They've got a name," Caleb said. His voice was neutral in the way voices get when the person using them is being careful. "Silas Crow. He runs a gang out of the hill country north of Raton." Silas Crow. She had not known the name. She had not known any of their names because knowing names meant looking, and she had kept her face down and her hands still and her breathing as quiet as possible during every second of that robbery because she had understood instinctively that the less she saw, the safer she was. But they had seen her. She understood that now. Of course they had seen her. "Has anyone told the sheriff where I am?" she asked. Another look between the 2 men. "I sent word last week," Caleb said quietly, "about finding you, in case there were people looking for you. And sheriff's deputy came out 2 days ago while you were resting. I talked to him." She stared at Caleb. "You didn't tell me." "You were—" "I was right there in the next room, Mr. Whitmore, recovering, not incapacitated." He met her eyes. "I know. I should have told you." "Good." The honesty of it stopped her. He didn't defend it, didn't explain it further. He said he should have told her, and left the words standing on their own. She breathed out slowly. "What did the deputy want to know? Whether you'd be willing to give a statement. What you saw, what you could identify." "And what did you say?" "That I'd ask you." She was quiet for a moment. Deaver had tactfully developed a strong interest in the horizon. "I'll give a statement," she said. "I saw enough, not faces. I kept my eyes down, but I heard voices. I heard them talk to each other. I heard a name." She paused. "Someone called someone else by name during the robbery." Caleb went very still. "Which name?" he said. She looked at him. "Silas." The silence that followed was the specific kind that arrives when something small and quiet turns out to be much larger than it looked. Wad. They drove back to the ranch without discussing it further, which was not avoidance. It was the particular restraint of people who understand that some conversations need time to settle before they can be had properly. But Evelyn sat on that wagon bench with her hands folded in her lap and ran the numbers in her mind with the same methodical attention she'd brought to Caleb's filing system. She was the only witness who had heard a name spoken. Silas Crow knew that a woman had been on that stagecoach, and Silas Crow had left her alive on the road, which meant either he hadn't known what she'd heard or he hadn't cared at the time. But a man like that she thought would eventually care. She didn't say any of this to Caleb. He didn't say it to her either. But when they got back to the ranch, and she moved to climb down from the wagon herself, and he said, "Let me," in a voice that was quieter than usual, she let him. And when his hands steadied her descent, and he held on 1/2 second longer than strictly necessary, and then let go, neither of them pretended not to notice. Some things don't need words. Some things are already understood before the words arrive. Dead. Pete was at the gate when they came in, and he had news written all over his face. Pete Dawson was constitutionally incapable of concealing anything, which made him an excellent ranch hand and a poor poker player. "There was a man here," he said before Caleb had even properly stopped the wagon. Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. "What man?" "Came about an hour after you left. Said he was looking for work. I told him we weren't hiring." Pete's eyes went briefly to Evelyn, then back to Caleb. He asked if we had guests. The stillness that moved through Caleb was visible only to someone who had been watching him carefully enough. A slight change in the set of his shoulders, a quality of attention going razor sharp. "What did you tell him?" Caleb said. "I said we didn't take in boarders." "What did he look like?" Pete thought. Pete was good with details when he thought them through carefully. Big man. Red-brown beard going gray at the edges. One eye sat lower than the other like he'd taken a hit to the face at some point. Nice horse, though. Better than a man looking for ranch work would usually have. Evelyn's breath stopped. She knew that description. Not from seeing him. She had kept her face down. But from the crack in the stagecoach floor she'd been pressed against, and from the angle available to her, she had seen boots. She had seen a man's posture as he moved past the coach. And she had seen at one point a hand reaching into the luggage rack above her, and on that hand, the particular shape of a ring, heavy silver misshapen on the right side, like it had been bent and never quite fixed. She had seen him and not known she was seeing him. He had been right there. She said nothing. But Caleb looked at her, and whatever he saw in her face made him swing down from the wagon immediately and say to Pete quietly but with absolute authority, "Lock the barn. Get Hector in from the north fence tonight, not tomorrow morning. And from now on, nobody comes onto this property that you don't know by name." Pete said, "Yes, boss," without asking any questions because Pete was smarter than his freckled face suggested. Caleb turned to Evelyn. "Come inside," he said. "Joe found." She told him everything. They sat at the kitchen table, not across from each other, the way they sat when she was working on his papers, but at the corner close enough that their voices didn't need to carry, and she told him everything she remembered. Every detail she had stored without knowing she was storing it. The voices. The specific weight of the silence before the robbery happened, the way it was too quiet before the shots, which meant they had been watching and waiting. The man with the ring. The name called out. She spoke carefully with the precision of a woman who understands that memories are not decoration, they are evidence. Caleb listened. He did not interrupt. He did not ask questions until she finished. And then he asked 3, each one clean and specific, and pulling at the corners of what she'd said, opening it out, checking the details from different angles, the way a man checks a fence line he suspects is under pressure. When he was done, he sat back and looked at his hands on the table. "He came here to find out if you were here," he said. "Yes." "Which means someone told him you'd been found on that road, that I'd brought you in." "Your deputy visit," she said quietly. Somebody talked. Small towns talk. He said it without bitterness, just as fact. "I'm not angry at anyone for it. But yes." She looked at him. "Caleb." She used his first name without deciding to. It came out naturally, and she didn't take it back. I should leave. He looked up at her. If I'm here, you're in danger. Your men are in danger. I'm not going to sit in your house and let them come here because of me. Her voice was even. She had thought this through on the wagon ride home. If I go to Cimarron and I'm in a public place with more people around. If you go to Cimarron alone, Caleb said, you're easier to get to, not harder. One woman in a boarding house is not safer than one woman on a working ranch with 3 men who know how to handle themselves. He paused. And me. She looked at him for a long moment. You don't owe me this, she said. I know that. I'm a stranger. I turned up on your road 3 weeks ago, and your whole situation has gotten... Miss Harper. He met her eyes directly. Evelyn. He used her name the way she'd used his without deciding to. I want you to stay. Not because I feel obligated, because I'm asking you to. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, Pete was somewhere calling to Hector. A gate clanged. One of the horses made a sound in the barn. All right, she said. All right. He stood up and she thought that was the end of it, but he stopped at the window and said with his back to her, I'm going to send a letter to the sheriff's office in Taos, tonight. Tell them about the man at the gate, about what you heard during the robbery. And in the meantime, we stay careful. He turned around. You stay close to the house. You don't go anywhere alone. You tell me if anything feels wrong. Any feeling doesn't matter how small. You tell me. She nodded. And, he said, and there was something in his voice now that she had not heard before. Not exactly softness, but the shape of softness. The place where softness would be, if he let himself, you stop telling me you should leave. She looked at him. I'll try, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something in the neighborhood. He went to write the letter. The reply from Morrow Creek arrived 12 days later. Garfield sent word out with the Thursday rider who came to the ranch gate and handed Pete a sealed envelope addressed to Miss Evelyn Harper, care of the Whitmore Ranch. Pete brought it in at breakfast and set it on the table beside her plate with the elaborate casualness of a young man pretending he had not been watching for that envelope for 12 days. She held it for a moment without opening it. Caleb refilled his coffee and said nothing. But he sat back down, which was unusual. He typically took his cup and went back to work. He sat back down and looked at the window. She opened the letter. She read it. She set it on the table. Well, Pete said. He had approximately 0 patience for suspense. The position was filled, she said. 3 weeks after I failed to arrive, they hired a man from Denver. Silence. I'm sorry, Pete said. He meant it. She looked at the letter one more time. Then she folded it, set it aside. It's all right, she said. And the strange thing, the thing that surprised her as she said it, was that she meant it too. There are 17 children in Cimarron without a teacher. Mr. Garfield mentioned it when we were in town. Caleb was looking at her now. You'd stay in Cimarron, he asked, carefully. I'd teach in Cimarron, she said. That's not the same as where I'd stay. The words landed in the room and sat there clear and open and waiting to be understood. Pete looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at the folded letter. I would need to speak with the town council, she said in her most practical voice. And there would need to be a proper arrangement. A salary, a schoolroom. I'm not going to stand in someone's barn and call it a school. No, Caleb said. You're not. I'm also not. This is not me asking to stay, Caleb. I'm not asking that. I know you're not. I'm saying that if the school and Cimarron were to come together, it would make sense for me to be nearby. At least for a while. Until I found appropriate lodging. It would make sense, he agreed in the tone of a man who is keeping something very carefully level. Pete was making no effort to look like he wasn't grinning. Eat your breakfast, Caleb said without looking at him. Pete ate his breakfast. She met with the Cimarron Town Council on the following Tuesday. There were 5 of them. Aldrich from the hardware store, Garfield from the post office, a cattle broker named Pemberton, who was largely silent and clearly present only because attendance was expected, the wife of the Methodist minister who had no official title, but was self-evidently the most influential person in the room, and a younger man named Reyes, who ran the livery stable and had 4 children of school age, and therefore the most urgent personal investment in the outcome. Evelyn sat down across from all 5 of them, and made her case in 20 minutes clearly and without excess, and answered their questions without hedging. Salary, curriculum, discipline. The question of whether she could manage boys older than herself, which she disposed of with a look that made Aldrich clear his throat and Reyes hide a smile. At the end, the minister's wife, whose name was Mrs. Beaumont, said, "Miss Harper, you have clearly survived a great deal in recent months. Can we rely on you to stay?" Evelyn looked at her steadily. "I am not in the habit of leaving places I've decided to stay," she said. "You have my word." Mrs. Beaumont looked at her for a long moment with the assessing gaze of a woman who had been reading people for 30 years and trusted her own judgment about them. "All right," she said. "Then we have a school." What happened next happened. The way important things often happen in communities, slowly, then all at once. A building was identified, a disused feed store on the east end of Main Street. Solid walls, a good floor. 2 windows that actually closed properly. Reyes volunteered his son and 2 other young men to clear it and fix the door. Aldrich contributed lumber for shelving. Mrs. Beaumont organized a collection of donated books that filled 2 crates and included, Evelyn noted with a private smile, 3 volumes of geography. Evelyn threw herself into it with the full force of a woman who had been without purpose for 3 weeks and found that the absence of it was intolerable. She was at the schoolroom every morning by 7. She was organizing, planning, cataloging the books, making lists of what was needed. She worked with the concentrated energy of someone who understood that usefulness was the best possible armor against everything she was not yet ready to feel. And every evening she came back to the Whitmore ranch. She hadn't arranged for that to happen exactly. There had not been a formal conversation about it. But there was no boarding house in Cimarron that was anything other than a room above a saloon, and Mrs. Beaumont had 2 spare rooms, but also 2 elderly parents living in one, and her husband's mother in the other. And the practical fact was that Caleb's ranch was 8 miles out, and Caleb had a wagon, and the arrangement simply continued. She was aware that it was becoming a subject of comment. She was aware because Pete told her with the same inability to conceal information that made him so readable about everything else. "People in town are talking," he said one morning, appearing at her elbow while she was sorting primers by level. "People in town are always talking," she said. "That's what small towns do. Hand me that stack." He handed her the stack. "They're saying you and Caleb..." "Pete. I'm just saying what they're..." "Pete." She looked at him levelly. "I know what they're saying. Thank you." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What are you going to do about it?" She stacked the primers. "Nothing. Nothing. Let people talk. The school will open in 6 days. Once there's something real to look at, the talk will find something else to be about." Pete thought about this. "You're not upset about what they're saying." She looked at him with the expression she was developing for this category of question, not unkind, just direct. "Pete, I have been robbed, abandoned in a desert, and threatened by an outlaw gang in the past month. What people in Cimarron are saying about my living arrangements is not currently at the top of my list of concerns." Pete blinked. Then he laughed, sudden and real, the laugh of a young man caught off guard by someone he underestimated. "Yes, ma'am," he said. But that evening alone in the kitchen, while Caleb was out in the far barn, and the house had settled into its particular nighttime quiet, she sat at the table with a cup of tea. She wasn't drinking, and let herself admit something she had been avoiding. She was not neutral about Caleb Whitmore. She had been telling herself she was. She had been filing him carefully under complicated and not yet, and too much has happened, and you came west to be a teacher, Evelyn, not to fall into something you didn't plan. She had been filing him there and moving on, and focusing on the work, because the work was real and the work was hers, and the work could not be taken away from her, the way everything else had been taken. But sitting in his kitchen at 9 o'clock at night with his books on the shelf, and his papers organized in the system she'd built, and his coffee cup on the hook where she'd suggested putting the hook. She was not neutral. She had known it when he said, "I want you to stay." She had known it when he held on a half-second longer, helping her down from the wagon. She had known it for a while before, that maybe since the day she found Clara's books, and he stood in the doorway saying, those were Clara's, with the voice of a man still carrying the weight of what he'd lost. She had known it, and she had not done anything about knowing it, because there was a significant difference between knowing a thing and deciding what to do with knowing it. And because Caleb Whitmore was not a man you moved toward quickly. He was a man you approached the way you approach something that had been alone for a long time, and learned to be careful around everything, carefully, steadily, without sudden movements, giving him time to understand that you were not going to leave. And because she was not sure yet that she wasn't going to leave, the school would keep her in Cimarron. That was certain. What it would not do was tie her to a ranch 8 miles east. That was a different choice. A choice she had not made yet. Not formally. Not in the way that mattered. She heard boots on the porch. She picked up her tea and pretended to drink it. Caleb came in, shook dust from his jacket, hung his hat on the peg. He looked at her at the table. "You're up late," he said. "I was thinking about the reading primers," she said. "The ones for the older children are too advanced. I need to find something in between." He came to the table and sat down across from her the way he did in the evenings, when the work was done, not always saying anything. Just being present in the same space which she had come to understand was his version of company. "I might have something," he said. She looked at him. "When Clara and I first came west," he said slowly, like a man finding his way across uncertain ground. "She brought a set of readers with her, for when she thought she'd be teaching out here eventually, when there was more time." He was looking at the table. "There were 3 volumes. Progressive. I think they'd be what you're looking for." Evelyn was very still. "You kept them," she said softly. "I kept everything she brought." "Caleb, those books meant something to her." He looked up. "They'll mean something to the children she would have taught." He said it plainly, without drama, but it cost something. She could hear that it cost something. She'd have wanted them used. She was not a woman who believed things should sit in boxes. Evelyn looked at him across the table. "No," she said. "I don't think she was." He held her gaze for a moment. "I'll bring them out tomorrow," he said. "Thank you." He stood up. "Caleb," she said. He stopped. She was not sure for a moment what she intended to say. Then she found it, simple and true. "What you did finding me, bringing me in everything after that. I want you to know that I understand what it cost. Not the money, not the trouble, what it actually cost." She paused. "You opened something back up that you'd closed." He was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe it needed to be opened," he said. He went to his room. She sat at the table a little longer. Outside, the desert was exactly as vast and indifferent and extraordinary as it had always been. The same desert that had tried to swallow her was still out there. Silas Crow was out there. The letter to Taos had been sent, and no reply had come, and the careful alertness on this ranch had not relaxed. Not really. Caleb was making sure of that in ways he was quiet about, but not subtle about. All of that was real. But so was this kitchen. So was the man who had kept his dead wife's books for 6 years and was now ready to let children read them. So was the fact that Evelyn Harper, who had lost everything on a desert road in August, had built something in the weeks since. Small, unplanned, assembled out of whatever was available, the way frontier people always built things. But real. And she was not. She realized lying to herself in the direction of neutral had become genuinely impossible. She was not only staying because of the school. She finished her tea. She went to bed. In the morning she had 17 students waiting, and somewhere in the hill country north of Raton, a man with a silver ring and one eye that sat lower than the other was remembering a stagecoach, remembering a woman who had kept her face down and her mouth shut, remembering that she was still alive, and beginning with the patience of a man who had always preferred to let problems come to him rather than chase them, to think about what to do about that. The school opened on a Monday. 17 children, ages 6 to 14. 3 of them had never held a pencil before. 2 of them spoke more Spanish than English. One boy, a 9-year-old named Samuel Reyes, the livery owner's son, arrived 20 minutes late on the first day, slid into his seat without apology, and looked at Evelyn with the assessing gaze of a child who had decided in advance not to be impressed. She looked back at him with the same expression. By the end of the first week, Samuel Reyes was the first one in the door every morning. She did not congratulate herself on that. She filed it away and kept moving, because 17 children with varying levels of preparation and attention and hunger for learning do not leave a person time for self-congratulation. They leave a person exhausted in the best possible way, the kind of exhausted that comes from having spent yourself on something that matters, which is completely different from the exhaustion of fear and survival that had been her companion for the better part of 2 months. She drove herself to Cimarron each morning and back each evening, which was the arrangement that had quietly solidified without anyone formally agreeing to it. Caleb had stopped offering the wagon as a favor and started simply having it ready at 6:30, the way a person prepares something for a routine they've accepted as their own. She had stopped thanking him for it and started just climbing up, which was its own kind of acceptance. They did not talk about what any of it meant. They talked about the children, about the ranch, about the letter from Taos that had finally come in the 3rd week of September saying that the sheriff's office was aware of Silas Crow's activities and was actively pursuing leads. They talked about Clara's readers and how they were working in the classroom. They talked about Pete's ongoing campaign to befriend a particularly unfriendly barn cat that had taken up residence in the tack room and seemed personally offended by the attention. They talked about everything except the thing that was growing between them, with the patient inevitability of something that does not need tending to survive. And underneath all of it, underneath the school and the routine and the careful normalcy, they were both constructing one day at a time. The thing that Evelyn thought about when the classroom was empty and she was putting the books away at the end of the day. And the thing that Caleb thought about in the hour before dawn, when the ranch was still and he was already awake, because he'd always been a man who woke before the day, called him, was the same thing. Silas Crow. Still out there. Still unaccounted for. The second man came on a Thursday. He didn't come to the ranch this time. He came to the school. She was alone when he arrived. The children had gone home. She was at the board erasing the arithmetic from the afternoon lesson, and she heard the door open behind her and turned, expecting Mrs. Beaumont, who sometimes stopped in on Thursdays to check on supplies. It was not Mrs. Beaumont. He was young, younger than she'd expected, 20 or so, with a face that wanted to look harmless and didn't quite manage it. He had the particular quality of stillness of a person who has practiced keeping their hands visible. "Miss Harper," he said. She held the eraser and looked at him. Her heart had moved into a different rhythm, but her face had not. "Yes," she said. "Sorry to bother you, ma'am. I'm looking for ranch work. Someone in town said you might know who's hiring in the area." She had been a teacher for less than 3 weeks. But she had been reading people for 26 years, and what she read now, standing at her own chalkboard with an eraser in her hand, was a man who was not looking for ranch work. "I don't know who's hiring," she said evenly. "You'd want to speak to the livery owner, Mr. Reyes. He keeps track of that kind of thing." "I'll do that." He didn't move toward the door. "You been here long, ma'am, in Cimarron?" "Long enough." "Come from back east," someone said. "Someone talks a lot," she said pleasantly. Something shifted in his face. Not much, but she saw it. "Just making conversation," he said. "Of course," she said. "Good luck with your work search." He left. She waited until his footsteps faded on the street outside. Then she set down the eraser, walked to the door, locked it, and stood with her back against it for 30 seconds, while she let her breathing return to something like normal. Then she went to find Reyes at the livery. "A young man," she said, standing in the livery stable doorway, describing him quickly and precisely. "Did he come here?" Reyes frowned. "No, nobody like that came by." She had known he wouldn't have. "Do you have a horse I can borrow for an hour?" she asked. Reyes looked at her. He was a practical man with good instincts and 4 children in her school, all of whom had come home talking about their teacher with the kind of enthusiasm that made him inclined to do whatever she asked. "Take the bay," he said. "She's easy." Dida. She rode to the ranch faster than she should have on a borrowed horse with tender feet that were finally 3 weeks in, fully healed. Caleb was at the gate when she came in, not because he'd been expecting her, but because some instinct for trouble had pulled him outside at the right moment. He saw her on the wrong horse going faster than the situation called for, and he was already moving before she'd fully pulled up. "What happened?" he said. "Not a question," she told him. All of it quickly and exactly the way she'd learned. He preferred no editorializing, just the facts in order, and then her reading of the facts. He listened to every word. When she finished, he said, "You're sure he wasn't just asking for work?" "He didn't go to the livery," she said. "He went to the school. He went directly to me. And then he left without talking to anyone else in town because I asked Garfield on my way out." Caleb's jaw tightened. "They're testing the ground," he said, "seeing where you are, what your movements are, whether you're protected." "Yes?" "Which means they already know you're the witness." "Yes." He turned and called across the yard. "Pete!" Then louder, "Pete!" Pete appeared from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He took one look at the two of them and dropped the rag. "Go to Cimarron," Caleb said. "Get Deaver if he's in town. Get Garfield to send the fast rider to Taos tonight, not Thursday tonight. Tell him we need the sheriff, not a deputy. Tell him to say that Caleb Whitmore's asking." Pete was already moving. "Hector," Caleb said, raising his voice again. "Get Thomas in from the east pasture." Hector appeared in the barn doorway. Now. He turned back to Evelyn. She was watching him run the situation, the way she'd watched him do everything with the same competent economy, every word and movement going exactly where it was needed. No wasted energy, no performance. "You did the right thing coming straight here," he said. "I know," she said. "Then I'm frightened." She said it simply the way she said hard things directly without dressing it up, because pretending not to be frightened would have been a waste of both their time. Caleb looked at her for a moment. "I know," he said. And then, "So am I." She had not expected that. The honesty of it steadied her more than reassurance would have. "What do we do now?" she said. "We wait for Deaver," he said. "And we don't leave you alone. Anywhere. Starting right now." Deaver arrived within 2 hours, and with him came a man Evelyn hadn't met, a former military man named Graves, who was now retired and living on a small property east of Cimarron. He shook her hand with the directness of a man who has assessed situations for a living and does not waste time on pleasantries when the situation is not pleasant. They sat at Caleb's kitchen table, all of them, including Pete and Hector, because Caleb believed in everyone who might be involved knowing what was happening, and Evelyn told the story a third time, each telling slightly sharper than the last as she worked out which details mattered most. When she finished, Graves said, "Crow doesn't leave witnesses." The room got very quiet. "He left me," Evelyn said. "He left you because you were already half dead on the road, and he thought the desert would finish it," Graves said, not unkindly, just factually. "Now you're not half dead. You're here, you're teaching school, you're visible, and apparently you heard his name." "I heard his name." "Then he'll come. Not the young man from today that's not Crow. Crow doesn't do his own scouting. He sends people first." Graves looked at Caleb. "How many men do you have that know how to shoot?" "3, plus myself." "I make 5, Deaver said. 6, said Graves. Evelyn looked around the table. "I want to be clear," she said. "This is happening because of me. I want to know exactly what is being planned, and I want a part in it." Graves looked at her. "Ma'am, Mr. Graves," she said in the voice she used for the 9-year-old, who had decided in advance not to be impressed. "I am the reason this man is coming here. I heard his name. I am his reason. I will not be managed around the edges of my own situation. Tell me what the plan is." A beat. Then Graves looked at Caleb. Caleb said, "Tell her." The plan was not complicated, because good plans are not complicated. Graves had a gift for stripping things down to what was necessary. The ranch had one main road in and 2 approach routes from the open land to the north and west. They would position a man at each approach from the moment darkness fell, rotating shifts. The house itself would have 2 people in it at all times, one at the front, one covering the back. Evelyn would move her teaching to the ranch for the time being. No more rides to Cimarron. No more being visible in town until this was resolved. She agreed to everything without argument, which surprised Graves and did not surprise Caleb. What she did not agree to was being one of the people who stayed inside. "I can shoot," she said. "My father taught me before he died. I haven't shot in 3 years, but it's not the kind of thing you forget the mechanics of." "Have you ever shot at a person?" Graves asked. "No. It's different." "I know." She met his eyes. "But I'm not asking to be in front. I'm asking not to be hidden in a room while other people defend me. I won't be hidden in a room." Graves studied her. "Can you hit a stationary target?" he said. "At what distance?" 30 yards. "Yes." "Moving?" "Probably." Graves almost smiled. "Probably," he repeated. "Honesty seems more useful here than confidence," she said. He did almost smile that time. "All right," he said. "You'll cover the back window. You stay inside. But yes, you're part of this." She nodded. She did not look at Caleb during this exchange, but she felt him looking at her. She knew what was in it, not quite pride, not quite fear, something that lived between the two in the particular territory that opens up between people when one of them is watching the other become more fully themselves. Says, 3 days passed. Nothing happened. The shifts held. Every morning, Evelyn taught the 3 children from the 2 nearest ranch families who'd been brought out to the Whitmore property as a precaution, a makeshift classroom in the main room with Clara's books and the primers she'd brought from the school. At night, the men rotated the watch, and nobody slept as deeply as they usually did, and the ranch had the contained, coiled quality of a held breath. On the 4th day, Thomas came in from the North Watch at sunrise with his expression set in a way that Evelyn had learned meant he had something to report and was choosing his words. "Tracks," he said to Caleb. "North pasture, multiple horses crossing east to west, sometime before midnight." Caleb said, "How many be 4, maybe 5. Evelyn was standing in the kitchen doorway. "They're walking the perimeter," Graves said from the table. He had stayed on sleeping in the bunkhouse and was drinking his coffee with the calm of a man in whose world this kind of news was not surprising. "Counting us, working out the layout." "How long before they move?" Caleb said. "If I had to guess?" Graves set down the cup. "Not long. Crow isn't patient. It's one of his few weaknesses." He paused. "His other weakness is that he thinks the people he's coming after are afraid of him. He adjusts his plans for fear. When people don't behave afraid, he gets imprecise." Caleb looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. "Then we don't behave afraid," she said. The letter from the Taos sheriff arrived that afternoon. It was 2 days late, which was on time by territorial standards, and it contained the information that a deputy named Haskell was being dispatched and would arrive within 4 days. It also contained, almost as a footnote, a piece of information that changed the temperature of the room when Caleb read it aloud. Silas Crow had been identified in connection with 2 murders, not just robbery. A freight wagon driver killed 3 weeks after Evelyn's stagecoach, and a woman in Raton, a shopkeeper who had reportedly overheard something she shouldn't have and whose death had been staged to look like an accident. The room was quiet after Caleb finished reading. Pete said too quietly, He kills witnesses. He kills inconveniences, Graves said. Witnesses, people who talk too much, anyone who makes his operation complicated. He's been doing it for 3 years and getting away with it because he moves before the law catches up. Evelyn sat down at the table. She thought about the shopkeeper in Raton. A woman alone, probably, who'd heard something and hadn't known what to do about it, or hadn't had time. She thought about how easily that could have been her. How easily that was supposed to have been her, left on a desert road in August to let the heat finish what he'd started. She thought about the young man who'd come to her classroom, harmless-looking, hands visible, asking about ranch work. She thought about how close he'd been, how alone she'd been. And for the first time since she'd ridden back to the ranch and told Caleb what happened, she let herself feel it fully. Not just the fact of the danger, but the weight of it. The specific personal terror of being hunted by someone who had done this before and gotten away with it. She sat with that for about 30 seconds. Then she stood up. 4 days is too long to wait for the deputy, she said. What can we do tonight? What they could do tonight was set a better trap. It was Evelyn who suggested it, and the simplicity of it was the thing that made Graves go quiet for a moment before saying slowly, "That could work." The logic was, this crow was surveilling the ranch because he needed to know where Evelyn was at all times. The scout from the school, the men walking the perimeter, it was all reconnaissance. He was building a picture. And the one thing that would bring Crow himself in was certainty that the picture was complete and the target was fixed. So we give him a complete picture, Evelyn said. A predictable routine. Clear, visible, consistent. He's been watching because things have been unpredictable. If I start moving on a schedule he can map, you become easier to plan around, Graves said. And a man who plans around something stops watching it as carefully. She finished. Caleb said, "You're talking about using yourself as bait." "I'm talking about being strategic," she said. "Those are the same thing." Caleb, "No." His voice was quiet but absolute. "Not you. Not directly." She looked at him. "I'm not saying I walk out into the road and wave," she said carefully. "I'm saying we give him a pattern, visible enough to be convincing. But the pattern is controlled by us, not him." The silence stretched. Caleb was looking at her with the expression she had come to understand was his version of a battle between what his head told him and what every other part of him was insisting on. His head was usually winning in this territory until recently. She was aware of what that meant. "We do it right," he said finally. "You're never actually exposed. You appear to be." "Yes. And the moment we have any indication they're moving, you come inside and stay inside." "Yes." He looked at Graves. Graves was nodding slowly. "It's better than waiting. Crow gets nervous when targets wait too long. He starts changing his approach. This keeps him in the plan we know." Caleb said, "All right." Then he looked at Evelyn and said quietly, just to her, "If anything goes wrong." "It won't," she said. "Evelyn." She held his gaze. "I'll be careful. I promise." He looked at her for one more moment, that long measuring look that had so much in it, and then he turned back to Graves. "Let's plan it," he said. They ran the pattern for 2 days. Evelyn walking to the barn at the same time each morning. Visible from the road, from the north pasture, from any of the angles a man positioned on the perimeter would be able to see. Regular, predictable, unhurried. The performance of a woman who did not know she was being watched, delivered with the precision of a woman who absolutely knew. She discovered a decent actress. Or maybe she had simply gotten good at performing normal, when things were not. On the second day of the pattern, Thomas reported that the north pasture tracks had moved closer. Whoever was watching was now watching from within the tree line on the northeast corner, which was 200 yards closer than they'd been. "He's almost satisfied," Graves said. "How much longer?" Caleb asked. "1 more day, maybe 2. He'll hit in the early morning, that's his signature. Before dawn, when people are at their heaviest sleep." The morning of the 3rd day, Evelyn came to breakfast and found Caleb already at the table, which was unusual, only in that he had not poured his coffee. He was sitting there without coffee, without papers, without any of the usual architecture of his early mornings. And when she came in and saw him, he said, "Sit down." She sat down. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to hear it the way I mean it, not the way it might sound." She looked at him. "Clara died in the spring," he said, 1878. Fever. It came fast and it went fast and she was gone in 3 days and I didn't—" He stopped. Breathed. "I didn't say enough while she was here. I was a man who thought there was more time than there was, and I said things carefully, because that's how I was built, and then there wasn't time anymore." He looked at the table. "I'm not built differently now. I'm still careful with words, but I've had 6 years to understand what it costs." She was very still. "I'm not saying this," he said, "because of what might happen tonight or tomorrow. I'm saying it because I realized I was doing the same thing I've always done. Taking my time, assuming there was more of it." He looked up at her. "You changed something in me, Evelyn, since the day I found you on that road. I don't know yet exactly what it is or what it means, but I know it's real, and I know I'm not willing to leave it unsaid." She looked at him across the table. Her chest had that feeling, the one that arrives when something you've been bracing against and hoping for, at the same time, finally becomes real. "Caleb," she said. "I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I just needed you to know." "Caleb." She said it more firmly, and he stopped. "I know." He looked at her. "I know," she said again. "And it goes both ways." She let him sit with that for a moment, the way he let her sit with important things. "But you're right that tonight is not the time. So we are going to get through what comes next, and then we will talk about the rest of it properly." He nodded. "Deal," he said. She reached across the table and put her hand over his for one moment, just one, warm and brief and absolutely intentional, and then she stood up and poured them both coffee.
Yeah, that's all.
They came before dawn, not the next morning. 2 mornings later. Evelyn had been awake for an hour already, sitting at the back window with the rifle Graves had shown her how to work 3 days ago, when she heard Thomas's signal from the north, 2 short bird calls, then 1 long one. They were moving. She heard Caleb's door open without a sound, heard him moving through the house with the particular lightness of a big man who had learned silence the way you learn anything you practice enough. The back door opened and closed. She did not look away from the window. Her hands were steady. This surprised her. In a distant observational way, she would have expected them to shake. But there was something that happened to fear when you had been waiting for a thing long enough and had made your decisions completely. It went quiet. Not absent, just quiet. Just present beneath the surface of her attention, like deep water beneath ice there, but not in charge. Graves had told her, "If someone comes through that back door and it isn't one of ours, you shout first. You give them 1 second. Then you do what you need to do." She heard shouting from the north side of the property. Caleb's voice. Then another voice, unfamiliar, rough with the particular elevation of anger that comes from a person who expected to find something sleeping and found something awake instead. "Where is she?" That voice. Not Caleb's. "You tell me where she is right now or I will burn this place to the ground." And Caleb's voice, absolutely steady. "I don't think you will." A shot. Then 2 more from different directions. Then running. She did not leave the window. The back door moved. She raised the rifle. The door opened and a man came through. Fast Young, the harmless-looking man from her classroom, except he did not look harmless now, and she said, "Stop," in her classroom voice, the one that had made Samuel Reyes freeze in his tracks, and he stopped. He looked at the rifle. He looked at her. "Put it down," he said. "Lady, you don't want to—" "I want you on the floor," she said. "Hands where I can see them. Now." Something in her voice convinced him. He got on the floor. Outside, the shouting had gone different. There were more voices now, including one she recognized as Deaver's, and the particular quality of shouting that shifts from violence to capture. The sound of something winding down rather than up. She kept the young man on her floor until Pete came through the back door 11 minutes later, breathing hard, and stopped dead at the sight in front of him. "He's down," Pete said, staring. "Boss has him. He has Crow." The young man on the floor looked up at Pete. "Who's got who?" "Your boss," Pete said, "is lying face down in the north pasture wondering what just happened. And you?" He looked at Evelyn. "Did you?" "He came through the back," Evelyn said. She was lowering the rifle now, letting her arms take the weight of it, because apparently the weight had not registered until there was no reason to hold it anymore. "I told him to get on the floor." Pete stared at her. "Yes, ma'am," he said.
Check the pool.
She found Caleb by the gate. He was standing over a man on the ground, big red-brown beard, one eye sitting lower than the other, just as Pete had described him. Hector was there, and Graves and Deaver. The man on the ground had his hands bound behind him, and the specific stillness of someone who has run a calculation and understood that the calculation did not go his way. Evelyn stood at the edge of the group. Silas Crow looked up at her, and in his face she saw something she recognized the moment when a person realizes that the thing they underestimated was the thing that undid them. He had underestimated the desert. He had underestimated the odds of her surviving. He had underestimated the ranch, the men, the trap. He had most thoroughly underestimated her. "You were on the coach," he said. His voice was low-controlled even now, which told her everything about the kind of man he was. "I was," she said. "I should have." "Yes," she said. "You should have, but you didn't." She looked at him for one more moment. Then she turned to Caleb. He was watching her with that same look, the one she was only just beginning to understand fully, the way you understand a word only after you've heard it used enough times in enough contexts. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No," she said. "There was a man at the back door. He's inside. Pete's with him." Caleb looked at her. "Did you?" "He's fine," she said. "He's on the floor, but he's fine. I used my voice." "Your voice," he repeated. "I'm a teacher," she said. "It's a very good voice." And Caleb Whitmore, with Silas Crow on the ground at his feet, and the sun coming up over the eastern ridge, and the morning finally coming in clean, laughed. Not the small, private, almost missed thing she'd seen at the kitchen table 3 weeks ago. A real laugh. Full and surprised and completely human. She looked at him and felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been tight since August, since the robbery, since the desert road. Not all of it, but enough. A door opening. He stopped laughing and looked at her, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing left to say about what was between them that hadn't already been said or would be said better later. Graves was binding the second man. Deaver was sending a rider for the deputy. Thomas was already walking the perimeter, methodical as always, checking what needed checking. It was over. The thing that had followed her across the desert was over, and Evelyn Harper was standing in the early morning of a New Mexico ranch with her feet firmly on the ground, a rifle in her hands, and a future ahead of her that she had not planned and could not entirely predict and wanted, with a clarity that surprised her with its steadiness, more than she had wanted anything since she'd sold her mother's piano and got on a train in Boston. She handed the rifle to Pete, who took it with the reverence of a young man who has just watched someone he admires do something quietly extraordinary. She walked back to the house. She put on the coffee, and she waited for what came next. The coffee was ready before Caleb came inside. She heard him on the porch boots, then the particular sound of a man stopping before he comes through a door, the way people stop when they need a moment to shift from one version of themselves to another. Outside had been the version that held a situation together. Inside was something else. Something that didn't have a name yet, but was waiting to be named. He came through the door. She was at the stove. She did not turn around immediately. She gave him the same courtesy he always gave her, a moment to arrive before being looked at. She heard him hang his hat, heard the chair pull out at the table. She turned and put the coffee in front of him, and sat down across from him, and they looked at each other the way people look at each other after something has happened that permanently rearranges the landscape between them. He looked tired, not broken. Caleb Whitmore did not look broken, but tired the way a man looks when he has been holding something at distance through pure will, and the thing is now gone, and the will has nothing left to push against. Graves is taking Crow and the other one into Cimarron, he said. Haskell's deputy should meet them there. Good. Deaver's staying through today. He wants to make sure there's no one else from the gang still out there. That's smart? Yes. Silence. She wrapped both hands around her cup. Caleb, she said. I know, he said. You don't know what I was going to say. You were going to say that it's over, and that you're all right, and that you want to talk about what you said at the kitchen table 2 mornings ago. She looked at him. I was going to say the coffee's strong, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Is it? Yes, you made it so I expected that. He looked at his cup, drank, set it down. It's strong, he agreed. They sat there, the two of them in the kitchen that had started as his, and become gradually without announcement, something shared. The morning light was coming in. Somewhere outside, Pete was talking to Hector in the low carrying tones of men wrapping up a long night. A horse moved in the barn. The barn cat, the unfriendly one who had been softening toward Pete for 3 weeks, made a sound that might have been called a greeting if you were in a generous mood. Normal sounds, the sounds of a ranch running. I meant what I said, Caleb said, quietly. The other morning. I know you did. You don't say things you don't mean. It's one of the things I figured out about you early on. She paused. It's also one of the things that made it very easy to trust you, which I wasn't planning to do. Trust anyone I mean, for a while. I know. I came west to be a teacher, she said. That was the plan. It was a good plan. I'd worked toward it for 2 years. And now I'm a teacher. She looked at him. Just not where I planned to be. He was quiet. Caleb, what are you asking me? He looked at his hands on the table. He turned the coffee cup slowly once, and then he looked up. I'm asking if you're going to leave, he said. Not immediately. Not this week. But eventually. When things settle. When your life here is steady enough that you could leave if you chose to. He held her gaze. I'm asking if you're choosing to. It was the most direct thing she had ever heard him say, which meant it had been the most difficult. She understood that. She understood the shape of what it cost a private man to put something that mattered to him into plain language and set it on a table between 2 people. I'm not going to leave, she said. He didn't move, but something in him shifted, visible only to someone who had been watching him for 3 months, and understood that for Caleb Whitmore, a half-inch change in how he held his shoulders meant more than other people's speeches. Evelyn, I'm not going to leave, she said again. Not because I have nowhere to go, not because things are easy here, or because I've stopped wanting other things. I'm saying it because this is where I want to be. She looked at him steadily. The school is here. The children are here. A beat. You're here. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, all right, just that, all right, just. But the way he said it, quiet and settled and final, like a door closing gently on everything that had been uncertain, made the 2 words carry more weight than most people's paragraphs. All right, she said. She finished her coffee. He finished his. Outside, the morning was getting on with itself, the way mornings do, regardless of what has been decided inside. Deputy Haskell arrived that afternoon. He was younger than Evelyn had expected, 28 at most, with serious eyes, and a manner that was all business, which she respected. He interviewed her at the kitchen table for 40 minutes, and he was thorough and careful, and wrote everything down in a small notebook, with the concentration of a man who understood that what he was recording was going to matter in a court of law, and he intended to get it right. She told him everything. The robbery, the voices, the name. The man at the schoolroom door. The boots in the ring she'd seen through the crack in the coach floor. All of it organized in sequence exactly as she'd organized everything since she arrived, clearly without excess, the way information is most useful. When she finished, Haskell looked at his notebook and then at her. Miss Harper, he said. "What you've described, the detail you've retained, is better than most witness accounts I take. A lot better." He paused. "Do you know why you remember it that clearly?" "Because I knew it might matter," she said. "When I was on the floor of that coach, I understood that keeping my face down was survival. But I also understood that whatever I saw from there was what I was going to have to describe later. So I looked carefully at everything I was allowed to look at." She met his eyes. "I planned to survive, Deputy, from the very beginning." Haskell looked at her for a moment. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I can see that." He left with his notebook and his prisoner, and the second man in handcuffs and Graves rode out with them as additional escort, and the road from the Whitmore ranch was quiet again by 4 in the afternoon. The thing about surviving a crisis, Evelyn discovered in the days that followed, was that the end of it did not feel the way she had expected. She had expected relief. She got relief. Yes, that was real. A loosening in her chest and her shoulders that she hadn't fully realized was there until it wasn't. She had expected to sleep better. She did sleep better. She had expected to feel safe in the school again, in the routine of the 8-mile drive, and the 17 children, and the primers, and the chalk, and Samuel Reyes arriving first every morning. What she had not expected was the grief. It arrived on a Tuesday, 3 days after Crow was taken into custody, while she was teaching arithmetic to the middle group and trying to explain long division to a girl named Anna Pemberton, who had the expression of someone being asked to solve the essential mystery of the universe, and suddenly, without warning, without cause, Evelyn's throat closed. She stood at the board with a piece of chalk in her hand, and for 4 seconds she could not speak. Then she cleared her throat and kept going, and nobody noticed, and she finished the day and drove home and sat on the porch of Caleb's ranch house in the cooling evening and let herself feel what she had been outrunning since August. The robbery, the desert, the 3 days alone, the fear that had lived underneath everything like a second heartbeat for 3 months. The loss of her trunk, her books, her mother's photograph, her father's pocket watch. All of it. She did not hear him come out. But she heard him settle into the chair beside her, and she did not look at him, and he did not say anything because he had an extraordinary instinct for when words were the wrong instrument. They sat there until the light went. Then she said, "I lost my mother's photograph in the robbery." He was quiet. "It was the only one I had. She died when I was 14. A pause. I think I've been not letting myself know that it was gone. Because if I knew it was gone, then the rest of it was real, and I had too much else to manage." "And now," he said. "And now Crow is in custody, and the school is running, and I don't have too much else to manage anymore." She breathed out. "So now I know." He was quiet for a moment. Then, what did she look like? She looked at him. He was watching the darkening distance with the steady patience of a man making room for something. "She had dark hair," Evelyn said, "like mine. And she was small. I got my height from my father. She had this way of looking at things she was curious about, like she was memorizing them. I used to think she was the smartest person I'd ever met, and then I got older and met more people, and I still think she was the smartest person I've ever met." She paused. She would have had opinions about everything that's happened this summer. Good opinions or bad ones. Complicated ones. She never had simple opinions. She always saw too many sides of a thing. A small sound that was almost a laugh. "She would have liked you." He turned to look at her. She could feel it without seeing it. "Would she?" he said. She had a deep appreciation for people who meant what they said. They were rarer in Boston society than you might think. She looked at her hands in her lap. "She also would have told me I was being stubborn about something obvious." "What's the obvious thing?" She looked at him. "Don't make me say it when you already know," she said. He held her gaze. The porch was dark now. The stars were coming in one by one the way they do in the territory, not like in Boston, where the city light washed them out, but here in their full and almost aggressive number, like an argument for the largeness of things. "I'm going to need you to say it," he said gently. "I've told you I'm careful with words. I don't want to assume. She looked at him and the steady openness in his face, and thought about Clara in the margin of her poetry book. Is this what he means? Or is it that we only understand what we've already lost and thought, no, not this time, not with this one? I love you, she said, plain and clear. I didn't plan to. I'm not sure when it happened exactly, somewhere between your filing system and your ranch hands and your dead wife's books. She held his gaze. I love you, Caleb. He reached across the distance between their chairs and took her hand. He held it. I know, he said. I've known for a while. Then why didn't you? Because I was waiting for you to be sure, he said. Not about me, about yourself, about staying, about choosing this, not just accepting it because you had nowhere else to go. His hand was warm around hers, unhurried, certain. I needed you to choose it. She looked at him for a long moment. You are the most patient man I have ever met, she said. I've been told I'm the quietest. Same quality, different expression. He almost smiled. Is that what you think? It's what I know, she said. He raised her hand and held it against his chest briefly, the way you hold something you've been waiting for and have finally stopped waiting for, and then he set it down on the arm of her chair and stood up. Come inside, he said. It's getting cold. She stood. Caleb. He stopped. I want to talk to Mrs. Beaumont tomorrow, she said, about whether there's a proper room I can rent in Cimarron, something appropriate. She looked at him steadily. I'm going to do this right. Whatever this is, I'm going to do it properly. He looked at her. I wasn't suggesting. I know you weren't, she said. I'm telling you what I think is right. I'm a school teacher. I have 17 students and their families watching how I conduct myself. And I want... She paused. I want what happens between us to be something we build, Caleb, not something we fall into because the circumstances made it easy. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll speak to Aldrich tomorrow. She looked at him. About the building next to the hardware store, he said. It's been empty for 2 years. He's been looking for a use for it. Big enough for 2 rooms and a proper kitchen. He met her eyes. If you're going to have your own place in Cimarron, you should have one that's actually yours, not a boarding room. She stared at him. Caleb, that's a practical solution, he said. It's Evelyn. He said it gently. Let me do something for you that you don't argue about. She closed her mouth. After a moment. All right. All right. They went inside. The following weeks moved with the particular quality of time that comes after a crisis, not slow, but differently paced, more visible, more present in its detail. The building next to Aldrich's hardware store turned out to be in better condition than expected. Aldrich, who had a daughter in Evelyn's classroom and whose wife had been one of the book donors, offered it at a price that Caleb said was fair, and Evelyn said was too low, and Aldrich said was whatever it was, take it or don't. She took it. Caleb, Pete, Hector, and Reyes from the livery worked on it on 3 consecutive Saturdays. They did not invite her to help with this, which she discovered on the first Saturday when she arrived with a plan to contribute, and found herself handed a cup of coffee by Pete, with the serene authority of someone carrying out orders, and told to sit and observe. This is what we do, Pete said. We build. You observe. I'm perfectly capable of... Miss Harper, Pete said. He was using his serious voice, which was funny on his young freckled face, but genuine. The boss said let you help if you really want to, but also said if you're sitting down, you'll think through what you need and tell us, and that'll be more useful than you swinging a hammer. She looked at Pete. She looked at Caleb, who was on the far side of the room pretending not to have heard any of this. She sat down. She thought. She told them in detail what she needed, where, and why. By the 3rd Saturday, it was a home. Small, solid, hers. She stood in the middle of the main room on the afternoon they finished, and she felt the particular pride of a thing that is yours, because you built it, not because it was given to you, not because circumstance delivered you to it, but because you made decisions that led you here, and the thing is real, and it is yours. Pete was looking at her with the expression of someone waiting for approval. It's perfect, she said. He visibly relaxed. "Don't tell the boss I was worried about that," he said. "I won't." "He said you'd like it." He was right. He usually is. Don't tell him I said that either. She moved in on a Sunday in October. It did not take long to move in because she did not yet have much. What she had was what had accumulated since August. The clothes that had been donated and supplemented the books she'd borrowed from Caleb that had become hers by adoption. A few things she'd bought in Cimarron with her first teaching salary. A quilt that Mrs. Beaumont had given her handmade blue and white that she'd pressed her hands against for a full minute before she could say thank you properly. And one new thing. She had commissioned a small portrait from a man in Cimarron who did not call himself an artist, but had a steady hand and a good eye. She had described her mother to him, dark hair, small the way she looked at things. She was curious about the particular set of her mouth when she was about to say something complicated. He had worked from her description alone, and it had taken 2 sittings of her talking and him listening and drawing. It was not exactly right. It couldn't be. He had never seen her mother. But it was close enough. It held something. She hung it on the wall across from the window where the morning light would find it. Caleb had driven her and her things to Cimarron. He helped carry the boxes without commentary, set them where she indicated, and stood in the middle of the room when it was done, and looked around with the expression of a man assessing something he had helped build, and wants to see if it turned out right. "It's good," he said. "It is," she agreed. He looked at the portrait on the wall. He had not seen it before. She'd kept it at the school until today. He looked at it for a moment without speaking. "Your description," he said finally. "Yes, as close as I could manage." He was quiet. "She looks like you," he said. "Around the eyes." Evelyn looked at the portrait. "People always said that," she said. He looked at her. The morning light was coming in, and it was a warm October morning, the kind that the territory does beautifully clear and unhurried, and she was standing in her own home for the first time in her life. Not a boarding room, not someone's back bedroom, her own home. And the man looking at her was someone she had chosen, and who had chosen her, and it was not simple, and it was not easy, and it was absolutely irreversibly real. "Come to Sunday dinner," she said. "I'm going to cook a proper meal in my proper kitchen and eat it at my own table. Come." "All right," he said. "Bring Pete. He'll be unbearable if he finds out he wasn't invited." "He'll find out regardless." "I know. Bring him anyway." Sunday dinner turned into a weekly event before anyone decided it would. It happened the way the best things happen between people who are not trying to arrange them. It happened because the following Sunday, Evelyn cooked, and Caleb came, and Pete came, and Hector came because Pete mentioned it, and Mrs. Beaumont came because Evelyn invited her, and Reyes came with his wife because Caleb ran into Reyes on Saturday and said something vague about Sunday, and Reyes interpreted this as an invitation, which it more or less was. 9 people at a table built for 6. The kind of crowded that is not uncomfortable but warm. The kind that makes people angle their shoulders to make room and reach across each other for the bread and talk too loud and laugh too easily. Evelyn stood at the stove at one point, stirring, listening to the noise behind her, and felt something she had not felt since before her mother died. The feeling was not joy exactly, though joy was part of it. It was more specific than joy. It was the feeling of a room being exactly what a room should be, full and particular and real, with people in it who had all separately chosen to be there. She had not built this. She had not planned it. But she had made the choices one after another since August that had led to this kitchen and this table and these people. Mrs. Beaumont appeared at her elbow. "What can I do?" she said. "Nothing. Everything's ready." "Then I'll stand here and talk to you, which was my plan anyway." She looked at the table where Caleb was listening to something Reyes was saying with the expression of a man who is genuinely interested, which surprised Evelyn every time she saw it. She had had to revise her understanding of his quietness, from aloofness to selectivity, which was a different thing entirely. "He's different," Mrs. Beaumont said. "Caleb. I've known him 6 years, since before I knew you. I'll tell you honestly, Evelyn, I was fond of him and concerned for him in equal measure. A man can be all right and still be lost." She was quiet for a moment. He's not lost anymore. Evelyn looked at him across the room. No, she said. He's not. Are you going to marry him? She looked at Mrs. Beaumont. Mrs. Beaumont looked back with the unrepentant directness of a woman who had helped run a frontier town for 30 years and had no patience for indirection. We haven't discussed it, Evelyn said. You should. Mrs. Beaumont, I'm 70, and I've earned the right to say obvious things directly. Discuss it. She patted Evelyn's arm. Now, let's eat before it gets cold. He walked her home after dinner. Everyone had gone. The table was cleared. The kitchen was clean. The evening was the cool blue of an October night in the territory. They walked slowly. Mrs. Beaumont told me to discuss something with you, Evelyn said. Did she? She was direct about it. She usually is. She wants to know if we're going to get married. He was quiet for half a block. What did you tell her? That we hadn't discussed it. She glanced at him. She told me we should. She's not wrong. She stopped. He stopped. They stood on the quiet main street of Cimarron at 9 o'clock on a Sunday evening in October, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and the distance between them had been closing since August, and was now as small as a breath. I'm not proposing on the main street, he said. I want you to know that's not what this is. I know, but I want to know what you think about the idea. She looked at him carefully. The way she looked at things, she was working out, measuring, turning over. I think, she said slowly, that I came west to build a life. Not to find a man to give me one. I want to be clear about that distinction. I know the distinction, he said. I've always known it. I think that whatever I build here, I want to build it with full choices. Not because circumstances pushed me, and not because I was grateful, and not because it's practical. I know. And I think... She stopped. Looked at him. I think that when I imagine my life in 5 years, in 10 years, you are in that picture, Caleb. Not as something that happened to me, as something I chose. She held his gaze. So yes, I think we should discuss it. He let out a breath, slow, the breath of a man releasing something he had been holding for a while. Then we'll discuss it, he said. Not tonight. No, not tonight. She started walking again. He fell into step beside her. Soon, she said. Soon, he agreed. At her door, she turned and looked at him one more time. Caleb, she said. Yes. Thank you for dinner, for all the Sundays. You cooked. You came. He looked at her. I'll always come, he said. She went inside. She stood just inside the door for a moment in the dark of her own kitchen in her own home, listening to his footsteps on the street outside, unhurried and steady, and exactly what she had come to expect from him. Everything he did was unhurried and steady, and exactly what he said it would be. She lit the lamp. She sat down at her table. She looked at her mother's portrait across the room in the dark now, except for the edge of lamplight reaching it. I know, she said to it quietly, because her mother would absolutely have had an opinion, and the opinion would absolutely have been, finally. I know. She smiled. Mug. 2 weeks later, the town held what Mrs. Beaumont called a community supper, which was what Cimarron called a party when it wanted to be dignified about it. It was ostensibly to celebrate the opening of the school's second month and the arrival of 4 new families who had settled in the area in the past 6 weeks, drawn by the kind of word that spreads in frontier territories when a place is acquiring the infrastructure of permanence, a school, a teacher, a sense that something is being built. Evelyn stood in the middle of it and watched what had happened to this small place in the months since she arrived. It was not dramatic. It was not the frontier of novels, all guns and gold and sweeping declarations. It was quieter than that. It was the Pemberton girl finally cracking long division. It was Samuel Reyes reading aloud to the class for the first time and looking up to see if anyone had noticed and finding that everyone had. It was 4 new families looking at the school with the expression that parents get when they understand that their children are going to be all right. Deaver found her by the wall. You changed this place, you know, he said. He was a direct man diver. She had always liked that about him. I opened a school, she said. No, you. He stopped working out what he meant. This territory had everything it needed. Cattle, land, water most years. What it didn't have was somebody who looked at it and thought, this can be more than survival. That's what a school means. That's what you are. She looked at him. I just teach arithmetic, she said. I know what you just teach, he said. And so do the parents of 17 children. He moved on to talk to someone else, and she stood there with her cup of cider and thought about what he'd said, and thought about a woman lying in the dust of a desert road in August who had thought, not here, please, not like this. She had meant not death, but she had also meant something else she understood now. She had meant not like this, not unfinished, not without having built something, not without having mattered somewhere. She looked across the room and found Caleb. He was talking to Thomas, which was rare enough that she noted it. Thomas, who lived in the barn by choice and spoke to almost no one, standing there talking to Caleb with the careful animation of a man who had been drawn out by something worth responding to. Caleb said something, and Thomas almost smiled, and then he noticed her looking and gave her a short nod, which from Thomas was approximately a standing ovation. Caleb turned. He met her eyes across the room. He did not smile exactly, but his face did the thing it did now. The thing she had learned to read the way she'd learned to read the signs in Clara's poetry books, the small shift that meant he was exactly where he intended to be looking at exactly the person he wanted to be looking at. She held his gaze, and in that moment, in the warm and crowded room with the fiddle starting up in the corner, and the children running past the adults' legs, and the smell of coffee and wood smoke, and people who had all separately survived something and arrived in the same place. In that moment, Evelyn Harper, who had come west with a trunk full of books and a plan, and nothing else, understood something she would carry for the rest of her life. She had lost everything on a desert road in August, and she had gotten back more than she lost, not in spite of the loss, because of what she had done with what came after. She crossed the room. He met her halfway. Dance, he said. She was surprised, not because he asked, because she hadn't known he danced. You dance, she said. Clara taught me. A pause. She said I was the worst student she ever had. High praise from a teacher. She thought so. She took his hand. They danced badly on his part, accurately on hers, and exactly right in the way that counted together, and unhurried, in a room full of people who had become, without her, planning it or expecting it hers. Outside, the same desert stretched in every direction, the same one that had tried to swallow her. But she was not in the desert anymore. She was here. She had chosen to be here, and she was never, not ever going to let herself forget the difference between a life that happens to you and a life that you build with what you have and who you find, and every single stubborn choice you make, when the easiest thing in the world would be to give up. She had not given up, and the room around her, the people, the noise, the fiddle, the 17 children who would come to her classroom on Monday morning and be slightly different than they'd been on Friday, because she had spent the week finding the right way into each of their minds. This was what not giving up looked like. This was all of it. This was enough. This was everything. He proposed on a Tuesday, not Sunday, not at a community supper, not in any of the moments that would have made for a better story later. He proposed on a Tuesday morning in November, when Evelyn was at her kitchen table before school grading arithmetic papers with a cup of coffee going cold beside her because she always forgot to drink it when she was concentrating, and he knocked on her door at 6:45, 15 minutes before he usually came to drive her to the school. And when she opened the door, he was standing there with his hat in his hands, and the particular expression of a man who has made a decision and is not going to unmake it regardless of what happens in the next 60 seconds. I'm not going to make a speech, he said. She looked at him. She was still holding Samuel Reyes's arithmetic paper, which had a spectacular error in the third problem that she had been working out how to address constructively. All right, she said. I thought about it, he said. Making a speech. I practiced one, actually, Pete helped. Pete helped you write a proposal speech. He had strong opinions about it. I'm sure he did. I threw it away, the speech, because everything I wrote sounded like someone else saying it. He looked at her directly the way he always looked at her when something mattered, without decoration, without hedging. I want to marry you, Evelyn. I want to build the rest of my life alongside whatever you're building. Not to take it over, not to manage it. Alongside. He paused. That's all I had. She stood in the doorway with Samuel's arithmetic paper in her hand. That's all you had, she said. That's all. She looked at him for one long moment. This man who had practiced a speech and thrown it away, because it didn't sound like himself, who had waited for her to be sure, before he said what he felt, who had kept a dead woman's books for 6 years, and then given them to children, because she would have wanted them used. This man who had lifted her off a desert road when she had nothing and asked for nothing in return, and become, without either of them planning it, the fixed point around which her entirely unplanned new life had organized itself. Yes, she said. He let out a breath. Yes, she said again, in case the first one hadn't been clear enough. Come in. Your coffee's going to be cold too. He came in. She put Samuel's arithmetic paper down. She poured him coffee, and he sat at her table, and they looked at each other across the small kitchen in the morning light, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because some things don't need language. Some things are already said in the quality of the silence they live in. Pete's going to be insufferable, she said. He's already insufferable, Caleb said. This will just give him a specific topic. She smiled. He picked up his coffee. She picked up hers, and this time she actually drank it. The news moved through Cimarron with the speed that small-town news always moves, which is to say, by afternoon everyone knew, and by the following morning everyone had an opinion, and by the end of the week Mrs. Beaumont had convened what she called an informal gathering, and everyone else called a planning committee, and which was functionally a group of 8 women telling Evelyn how her wedding was going to go. Evelyn sat in the middle of it, with the expression she had developed for situations where she was not in charge and had accepted that she was not in charge and was choosing her battles. Mrs. Beaumont wanted the church. The minister's wife, Mrs. Beaumont herself, since they were the same person, also wanted the church. This was a majority position, and Evelyn did not argue it. Mrs. Reyes wanted flowers from the greenhouse her husband had built her 2 years ago, and rarely got a formal occasion to supply. Evelyn said yes because Mrs. Reyes had 4 children in her classroom, and also because the greenhouse flowers were genuinely beautiful. The other 6 women had opinions about the cake, the date, the guest list, and the dress, and they delivered these opinions simultaneously, and with great warmth, and very little coordination, and Evelyn sat in the middle of it and thought, this is what a community is. Not the big moments, not the crisis and the defense and the resolution. This. 8 women arguing about flowers in a warm room because they want to be part of something good happening to someone they've decided is theirs. She had not had this in Boston. She had had neighbors and colleagues, and Mrs. Aldrich crying on the train platform, but not this, not the particular claiming energy of people who have watched you go through something hard and come out the other side and feel proprietary about your happiness because they were there for the difficult parts. She let them plan. She said yes to the church, yes to the greenhouse flowers, a qualified yes to the cake suggestions, and a firm but pleasant no to one particular dress idea that she could not in good conscience wear in front of 17 students. She drove home that evening, thinking about her mother. She thought about her a lot these days. Not with grief exactly, though grief was always somewhere in the neighborhood. More with the particular ache of wanting to share something with someone who isn't there to share it with. She thought about what her mother would have said about Cimarron and the school, and the 8 women, and the church, and especially Caleb. She thought about this for the length of the drive, and when she got back to her house, she sat down and wrote a letter. Not to anyone in particular. She had no family left in Boston, not close family, but she wrote it anyway, wrote it to her mother, which she had not done since she was 14 years old, and her mother had been 3 weeks dead, and Evelyn had not known what else to do with the things she needed to say. She wrote, I found a place. I didn't find the place I was looking for. I found a better one. I think you would approve of it. I think you would approve of him. He is the kind of man who means what he says, and says what he means, and was broken by grief, and didn't use his grief as an excuse to become smaller. I know you would have liked that about him. She wrote, I'm going to be all right. I want you to know that. I'm going to be more than all right. She folded the letter. She did not send it anywhere. She put it in the back of Clara's poetry book in the margin space that Clara had left blank, and she put the book back on her shelf. Some things you keep for yourself. Some things you just need to have said. December arrived cold and quick. The school closed for 2 weeks over Christmas, and in those 2 weeks Evelyn did 2 things she had not expected to do. The first was that she went back to the desert road, not alone. She asked Caleb to take her, and he did without asking why, because they had both learned that the important things between them did not always need explanation before they happened. Sometimes you understood the reason after. She stood at the place where she thought it had been, though the desert had rearranged itself since August, as deserts do, indifferent to human landmarks, and she looked at the ground for a long time. Caleb stood beside her and said nothing. She was looking for something, and she was not sure what it was until she found it, which was the understanding that she was not afraid of this place anymore. She had been without knowing. It had flinched away from thinking about it directly, had kept it in the peripheral vision of her memory, had narrated it to others in the flat, factual tone she used for things she was not ready to feel fully. She was ready now. She looked at the ground where she had fallen, and she let herself feel all of it. The terror of the 3 days, the particular quality of despair that arrives when the body gives out and takes the will with it, the smallness and the silence and the vast indifferent heat. She felt it clearly and completely, and then she let it be what it was, which was part of her story, not the end of it. A chapter, not the conclusion. Evidence of what she had survived, not definition of who she was. She breathed in. She breathed out. Ready, Caleb said. Yes, she said. They drove home. That was the first thing. The second thing was that she wrote to the school board in Boston. Not her old school board. The central administrative office of the Boston Public Schools, where she had spent 2 years trying to get a teaching position before the Western advertisement had caught her eye. She wrote to them about the Cimarron School, its enrollment, its students, what they were learning, the families it was serving. She wrote about the particular challenges and the particular rewards of frontier education. She wrote at the end a single paragraph about what she believed the purpose of a school was in a place like this. She wrote, "A school in the frontier does not merely teach children to read and calculate. It tells them every day they attend it that their lives are worth the investment of knowledge, that they matter enough to be educated, that the future is a place they are being prepared to inhabit, not merely stumble into. I believe this is true of all schools everywhere. But here, where survival has been the organizing principle of every family's existence, it is the most urgent kind of true." She sent the letter. She did not know what she expected from it. What she got 6 weeks later was a letter back not from the school board, but from a woman named Frances Alcott, who ran a private charitable organization in Boston devoted to funding frontier education initiatives, and who had read Evelyn's letter after someone at the school board passed it along, and who wanted to know more about the Cimarron School and what it needed. Evelyn read the letter 3 times. Then she went to find Caleb. She found him at the ranch she still came to. The ranch several times a week. Had never quite stopped the rhythm of it, too settled to abandon, and she handed him the letter without preamble and watched him read it. He looked up. "This is real," he said. "The letterhead is real. The address is real. I checked Garfield's directory. Funding for the school. Potentially. She's asking what we need." She sat down. "I need to write back. I need to know what to ask for." "What do you need?" "More books. A proper map. A second room eventually when enrollment grows, which it will. There are 3 new families coming in the spring according to Reyes." She thought. "A salary that isn't contingent on the town council's cattle season." He looked at her. "That last one," he said. "I know. It's the important one." The town council paid her from a fund that was, practically speaking, linked to the economic health of the territory. 2 poor cattle seasons in a row, and the fund went thin. She had not worried about it yet because the current season had been decent. But she was a woman who looked at structures clearly, and the structure had a vulnerability, and she knew it. "Ask for an endowment," Caleb said. She looked at him. "Ask her to set up a fund specifically for the teacher's salary," he said. "Independent of the council. Enough to cover 5 years so that whatever happens with the cattle market the school runs." He paused. "That's what keeps you here permanently. Not just this year." She stared at him. "You've thought about this," she said. "I've thought about everything that keeps you here permanently," he said without looking away. She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm already marrying you," she said. "You don't need to fund my salary to keep me." "I know that," he said. "That's not why. The school is yours, Evelyn. It should be able to stand on its own, same as you do." She was quiet. This was the thing about Caleb Whitmore, the thing she had not known how to articulate to Mrs. Beaumont or to anyone else when they asked what she saw in this quiet, careful man. He understood the difference between loving someone and trying to contain them. He had watched her build her independence and her purpose and her place in this community, and he had never once tried to make himself the center of those things. He had been beside them. Steady, certain, present. She picked up the letter. "I'll ask for the endowment," she said. "Good. And I'm going to tell her I want the school named for Clara." He went very still. She looked at him. "She wanted to be a teacher," Evelyn said. "She brought the readers west. She filled the margins of her books with questions. The school exists because her books were the first ones in it, and because the man who loved her became the kind of man who rescues strangers from desert roads." She held his gaze. "The school should have her name on it. It's the right thing." He looked at her for a very long time. "Yes," he said. His voice was slightly different from usual, not broken, but textured the way voices get when something has been moved. "That's the right thing," she wrote to Francis Alcott that evening. They were married in February. The church was full, which surprised Evelyn, because she had not expected to know enough people in Cimarron to fill a church, and then she counted the faces and realized she knew every single one of them. The parents of her students, the men who had built her house on 3 consecutive Saturdays. Deaver and Graves both cleaned up to a degree she would not have predicted possible. Thomas, who did not come inside the church, but stood at the window and looked in, which was, she understood immediately, Thomas's version of being present, and she was more moved by it than she expected. Mrs. Beaumont cried. She had been emphatic in the planning stages that she would not cry, and she was crying before Evelyn reached the front of the church, and she was doing it with the dignity of a woman who has decided that if she's going to cry properly. Pete was standing beside Caleb as his best man, and had the expression of a young man who was holding himself together through sheer force of will and was going to completely fail to hold himself together within the next 5 minutes. He made it to the vows. Then he did not make it. She heard him behind Caleb and kept her eyes on Caleb's face, and Caleb's face was steady and certain, and looking at her with the absolute uncomplicated directness she had come to love most about him. He was not thinking about what he looked like, or what people would remember, or what came next. He was looking at her. That was all. Just her. The way he always looked at her when something mattered. She said her vows clearly and without shaking. He said his quietly, but every person in that church heard them, because the church had gone so still that his ordinary speaking voice was enough. When he said "I will," she believed him completely. Not as a feeling, not as hope, as fact. As something she knew, the way she knew that the sun rose east and water found its level, and children given the right conditions would always choose to learn. She knew it as something that had already proven itself true before it was formally declared. He kissed her, and Pete made a sound that he would later describe as dignified, and that no one else present agreed was dignified. She laughed. He smiled, the real one, the full one, the one she had been collecting since the kitchen table 3 months ago when they were talking about the school, and she had said something that surprised him. It was the best thing she had ever collected. Spring came early that year. The 4 new families arrived in March, as Reyes had predicted, and with them came 9 more children for the school, which meant the second room was necessary sooner than Evelyn had planned. The endowment from Francis Alcott came through in April, more than she'd asked for, with a note that said the letter Evelyn had written about the purpose of a frontier school had been read aloud at 3 separate fundraising events in Boston, and had, in Mrs. Alcott's words, opened more wallets than any speaker we have engaged in the past 4 years. Evelyn read that and thought about her mother's piano and the train at South Station and Mrs. Aldrich crying on the platform. She thought, I'll let you know when I get there. She was there. She was more there than she had ever imagined getting. The second room was built in May, and the school the Clara Whitmore School for Frontier Children. The name engraved on a small wooden sign that Caleb made himself and did not tell her about until it was hanging above the door enrolled 26 students that fall. Caleb drove by it on his way through town one morning and stopped the wagon and looked at the sign for a long time. Pete, who was with him, had the sense not to say anything. After a while, Caleb said, "She would have been glad." Pete said, "Yes, sir." They drove on. The first time Evelyn truly understood what she had built, not just the school, not just the marriage, not just the life in Cimarron, but the larger thing. The thing that had no single name was a morning in September, the first anniversary of her arrival in the territory. She did not know it was the anniversary until she was marking it. She had been thinking about something else. One of her older students, a girl named Ruth, who had the makings of a real scholar and whose parents were already talking about pulling her out of school to help with the new baby, and she turned the date over in her mind the way you turn something over without looking at it. And then she looked at it. September. 1 year. She was in the schoolroom alone. The children had gone home. The afternoon light was the particular gold of early fall, the kind that makes everything look slightly more real than usual, or maybe more like itself, sharper, warmer, more present. She sat down at her desk. She thought about the woman who had gotten on a train in Boston in June of last year with a trunk full of books and a plan, who had sat in a stagecoach and watched the country change through the window, getting more and more itself, less and less like anything she'd known, who had kept her face down on the floor of that coach and stored everything she could see from 2 inches off the ground because she had decided she was going to survive, and surviving meant paying attention. That woman had lost everything. And then not easily, not without cost, not without the kind of fear that leaves a mark. Even after the thing that caused it is gone, that woman had built more than she'd lost. She had built a school with 26 students and a name above the door that honored a woman she'd never met. She had built a home in a town she had never planned to be in. She had built a marriage with a man who had been broken by grief and had chosen slowly and deliberately to be unbroken. She had built a table that seated 9 on Sundays. She had built relationships that had the particular density of things that have been tested with Mrs. Beaumont, who cried at her wedding and was forthright about obvious things with Pete, who could not conceal information and had a complicated relationship with an unfriendly barn cat, with Reyes, who had given her a horse when she needed one, without asking why, with Graves, who had believed her when she said she could handle a rifle at 30 yards. She had built a life. Not the life she planned. Better. Not easier. She would not have said it was easier. There was still the knowledge of what it had cost to get here, and that knowledge did not get smaller with time. It just got more settled. She would carry the summer of 1886 for the rest of her life. The terror and the 3 days and the heat and the particular silence of a desert at noon. She would carry it the way you carry the things that made you, not as a wound, not as a trophy, but as a fact. One of the true facts of herself. But she was here. She was here, and it was real, and she had chosen every part of it. The door of the schoolroom opened. Caleb. She looked at him. He was standing in the doorway the way he'd stood in countless doorways since August of last year, not quite inside, not quite out, giving her the moment to arrive before being looked at. She had never told him she'd noticed that about him, but she had. "I thought you might be here," he said. I lost track of time. It's nearly dark. I know. She didn't stand up yet. Do you know what today is? He came inside. He sat down at one of the children's desks, too small for him. He always looked slightly absurd at them, which was something she privately loved, and looked at her. 1 year, he said. You remembered. I remember the day I found you, he said simply. I'm not going to forget what day it was. She looked at him sitting at a child's desk in her school in the last of the afternoon light. What did you think? She said, when you found me. What was the first thought you had when you saw me on that road? He thought about it. He was always honest when she asked him direct questions about his inner life. He didn't deflect, didn't minimize, just went looking for the true answer with the same care he brought to everything. I thought you were already dead, he said, for about 2 seconds. And then I saw your hand move and I thought... He stopped. I thought someone left her here. Someone left another person alone to die out here and just rode away. He paused. I was angry. At them. At the idea of it. The specific cruelty of it. Leaving a person. He looked at her. I don't leave people. I never have. No, she said. You don't. She stood up. She came to where he was sitting and she put her hand on his face, the way she had only learned to do in the past year. She had not been a demonstrative person before, had kept physical affection close, had not learned yet that it was a language she was fluent in, and he turned into it slightly, the way he always did, the gesture of a man who had lived without being touched kindly for a long time, and still found it remarkable when it happened. You saved my life, she said. I want you to know that I know that. Not in the easy sense, in the full sense. He put his hand over hers. You gave mine back, he said. So we're even. She looked at him. We're not even, she said. That's not how it works. That's not how any of this works. You don't even a thing like this, Caleb. You carry it with you, and you let it make you better, and you try to pass it on to whoever comes next. She thought of her 26 students. She thought of Ruth, who was going to be a scholar, who was going to be pulled out of school by well-meaning parents who didn't understand what they were interrupting, and who Evelyn was going to fight for with the full force of everything she had. You pass it forward. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up, unfolding from the too small desk with the slight awkwardness that always made her want to smile, and he was close, and the school was quiet, and outside the last of the September light was going. We should go home, he said. Yes. Both homes or one? It was a question they still asked occasionally, because there were still both her house in Cimarron, the ranch 8 miles east, and they moved between them with a practical flexibility that scandalized no one because they were married now and could scandalize anyone they chose. The ranch, she said. I want to sit on the porch. It'll be cold. I know. He did not argue. They drove out to the ranch in the cooling dark, and she sat beside him on the wagon bench the way she had the first time he drove her to Cimarron, but nothing else was the same. Not the silence between them, not the air, not the woman she was, not the man he was, not the direction of the journey or its meaning. They sat on the porch. She had her coat, and he had his, and the sky above the territory was doing what it always did in September, showing off basically in the extravagant and entirely unself-conscious way of something that has never had to try to be magnificent. They sat for a long time without talking. Then she said, I want to go back to that road every year. He looked at her. On the anniversary, she said. I want to go back and stand there, not to mourn it, not to make a thing of it, just to remember who I was when I was there, so I don't ever stop knowing the distance I traveled. He was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. You'll come with me. Every year, he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He did not move. Just let her the way he always let her, without stiffening or adjusting, as though she had always been there, and he had simply been waiting. Caleb, she said. When you found me. When you lifted me off that road. Did you have any idea? No. he said. None. Me neither. The stars were fully out now, all of them, the whole argument for the largeness of things. I was so angry, she said quietly, on that road, at the end before I went under. I was so angry at all of it, the robbery and the luck and the unfairness of it. I'd worked so hard to get there, and it was all just taken, in 20 minutes. I know. But then, she said. She stopped. She was working out how to say it correctly because it mattered, and she wanted it to be precise. Then I think about where I would have been if it hadn't happened. If I'd made it to Morrow Creek the way I planned. Teaching in a town I don't know. Living in a boarding room. Starting from scratch with strangers who don't know what I came through. She was quiet. I would have been all right. I think I would have built something there too. I'm not a person who doesn't build things. No, he agreed, you're not. But it wouldn't have been this, she said. It couldn't have been this. This specific thing, this particular people. You. She lifted her head and looked at him. I spent a long time trying to figure out whether I was supposed to be grateful for the robbery. And I'm not. I'm not grateful for it. It was a terrible thing done by a terrible man, and it cost me real things that I will not get back. A pause. But I am grateful for every single choice I made after it. Every one. Because they led here. And here is... She stopped. Here is what? He said softly. She looked at the sky. She thought about 26 children who came to the Clara Whitmore School every morning. She thought about Sunday dinners that seated 9. She thought about a portrait of her mother that caught the morning light. She thought about a man who had lifted her off a desert road and asked for nothing and given everything and chosen her every single day since. Here is where I was always supposed to end up, she said. I just took a harder road to get here than I planned. Caleb was quiet. Then he said, The hard road is how you know you're not lost. You can only be lost on the easy ones. She turned to look at him. Did you just say something profound? She said. Don't make it strange. Caleb Whitmore. That was genuinely profound. Pete would say I've been spending too much time with a school teacher. Pete would be right. He almost smiled. She leaned back against him. They sat until the cold made sitting impractical, and then they went inside, and the ranch house that had been the quietest place in New Mexico was quiet in a completely different way. The way a place is quiet when it is full of the right things, when the silence is chosen rather than imposed, when two people have figured out not only how to be together, but how to be themselves while being together, which is the harder and more important skill. She fell asleep that night thinking about Ruth, who was going to be a scholar. She woke up the next morning before dawn, old habit, the kind that becomes a feature of your character rather than an imposition of circumstance, and lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of a ranch that was alive and running and full. Then she got up. She made coffee. She sat at the table, and Caleb Whitmore, who had always woken before the day called him, came out of the bedroom and hung his hat and sat down across from her, and she pushed his cup toward him, without looking up from the letter she was writing to Francis Alcott about Ruth, and he picked it up and drank it. The same kitchen, the same table, the same two people, and nothing, not one single thing, the same as it had been. A year ago, she had been a woman lying in the dust of a desert road with nothing left and nowhere to go. Now she had a school with 26 students and a name above the door. She had a home in Cimarron and a porch on a ranch 8 miles east, and a table that seated 9 on Sundays. She had a husband who meant every word he said and said only the words he meant. She had a community that had decided she was theirs. She had a life that had not been given to her, not handed to her by luck or birth or circumstance, a life she had built, choice by choice, from the ground up, starting from nothing in the dust of a New Mexico summer, because she had made a promise to herself that she would not give up, and she had kept it. She had kept it on the road, and she had kept it in the ranch house, and she had kept it in the schoolroom, and she had kept it every morning. She got up before dawn and sat at a table and picked up her pen and got on with the work of being the person she had decided to be. That was all. That was everything. That was the whole story. Not the robbery, Not the rescue, not even the love, though the love was real and permanent and the best of it. The whole story was a woman who decided not to stop, who kept going when the going was brutal, and kept building when the building was hard, and kept choosing the life in front of her, even when the life she'd planned was gone. Who arrived broken at a stranger's door and absolutely and completely refused to stay broken. And who changed everything for herself and for everyone who knew her simply by being exactly as stubborn and exactly as strong and exactly as fiercely irreversibly alive as she had always been. That was Evelyn Harper. That was the woman the cowboy found in the dust. That was the woman who changed his life. And she was never not for one single day of the years that followed anything less than exactly who she had chosen to be.